The following podcast is proudly brought to you by Vite Ramen. Use the link in the description and use offer code BROKENSILICON to get 10% off tasty, healthy, and easy to make ramen. And also use the offer code BROKENSILICON to get 25% off Windows keys and die shrink to get 3% off everything else on the website at cdkeyoffer.com. Now on with the show. Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Tom, and today I am joined, actually once again this year, by one of my favorite, one of my favorite people to talk to. He always brings really in-depth thought into anything, even if it's a subject that's usually not covered on his channel, which is, of course, needs almost no introduction to Hardware Unboxed. But why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey, it's Tim from Hardware Unboxed here. I guess this is my third podcast I'm doing with you guys, I think.
Third or
fourth, something like that. I've been on a few times anyway, and I've always enjoyed chatting with you, so I guess I'm back to talk about whatever's been going on.
Yeah, I mean, usually I try to get you on at some point around either monitor, like image quality testing, or laptop release or unveiling news, because that's typically what you specialize in, if you will, at Hardware Unboxed, right?
Yeah, I think that's probably most of the content that I make throughout the years on either of those two things. Obviously, the image quality stuff doesn't come up too often. Maybe it'd be nice to get a few more things coming through there. But yeah, monitors, I spend a lot of my time doing that sort of stuff. So yeah, I'm sure there'll be a few questions that we'll chat about that today.
Let's just start with the monitor questions. Kunahoon25 writes in, and he says, "Hey, Tom and Tim, I would like to know why are 32-inch 4K 144Hz monitors so expensive when they aren't even that good? Right now, I can buy an Aorus F048U and a LG C148-inch for under $1,000, and they are far superior, at least in my opinion, to any other 4K monitors on the market right now, but in many cases, they're cheaper and better than the competition. When do you think we'll really start getting better 4K 32-inch monitors with HDMI 2.1 support and at least HDR 600 in the $700 to $750 range? With the launch of RDNA 3 and Lovelace around the corner, you would think these companies would want to make 4K gaming more accessible ahead of time to gamers."
Yeah, you'd think so. I mean, a lot of these things come down to the competition in the monitor space. I think, how many people are using a 48-inch TV in place of a 32-inch monitor? I'm sure there's some people. But luckily, I think we're not that far away. We have seen some 4K 144Hz monitors of that size hit like $700-ish, $750. I think there's the Gigabyte M32U, something like that. That's around that. I don't think it's HDR 600, but
I was gonna say
HDR rankings.
Around Christmas time, co-host of Broken Silicon, Dan, it was a deal. It was quite a bargain, I thought. But I managed to convince my parents to chip in for a Christmas present for him. That was an 800, I want to say 850. I think it was $800 monitor, and it was 4K 144 hertz, HDMI 2.1, latest USB-C, which can also run 4K 144 hertz over at HDR. I think 600. I could tell when I plugged in a console, the HDR did look better on this HDR monitor as opposed to the one I have. So that was $800 last year. I think we're getting close if that's your bar.
Yeah, I think so. And I think once we, obviously recently we've had the Samsung QD OLED and those sort of products. Once we start getting more of those, these products will get a lot cheaper. But even in the past year, the pricing of 4K monitors has come down a lot. We've had launches that have hit, not for 32 inches in size, but you can get pretty good monitors for $600 these days for 4K 144 hertz. So yeah, we're not too far away with this at all, I don't think.
Yeah, and I think at that pricing, around 600 to 750 is where I stop feeling like I'm getting fleeced by these companies. Yeah. Could it maybe be cheaper relative to a 4K 120 hertz OLED TV, smart TV? Maybe, but at least it's typically 33% to 50% less, even if it's not OLED. At least we're paying less for less at this point, I would say, whereas we were paying more for less actually a few years ago.
Yeah, for sure.
FPGTA writes in, and he says, "Hey, Tom and Tim, this question is more directed towards Tim. In the coming 2 years, we are going to have an abundance of display technologies to choose from. Just to list them for due diligence, there's IPS, TN, VA, micro-LED, QD-OLED, WLED, and even true RGB OLED in 2023. It's going to be an exciting time for people who have been waiting for a massive change in the display tech space. Which of these new technologies do you expect to gain a foothold in the market, and which of the old ones do you expect to fade into the annals of history?"
Oh, it's an interesting question. I think TN is pretty much at the end of its life. We don't really see too many more releases these days. Even the super fast 360 hertz displays hit IPS first. So I think, TN, we could pretty much call it a day on that one, except for some very specific products. When it comes to all the OLED tech, I don't know which one of those is going to come out on top, because we've got one QD OLED ultra wide monitor. We've got 0, what I would class as sort of monitor size W OLEDs, and then obviously RGB OLED is, we haven't really seen any gaming options for that yet. So, I think for calling that as which one of those is going to take over, we're just going to have to wait and see which products end up being the best for monitors. Obviously, my preference would be RGB OLED, because for text, you get the nice sort of clarity there. But if they can't get, the brightness up, or burn-in's too much of an issue, then, there's so many different considerations there. But I think for the LCD-based stuff, IPS has really dominated the market in the last couple of years. VA is sort of... There used to be more higher end options, but there were obviously lots of issues with them aside from a few select products. And it just doesn't seem like there's been that much innovation aside from the Odyssey G7 from Samsung, which is a bit of a surprise. So I think, IPS is probably going to be the one that wins out there, and certainly is winning at the moment. And then, micro LED doesn't even... I don't know when that's actually going to hit reasonable products. It's just not, seems to always be, 3 years in the future. So we'll see about that.
Yeah, I don't think it's as bad as quantum computing, but when people ask me about micro LED, it's again, OLED TVs were shown off by LG in 2012, and took them how long for them to really become a real technology? So from my perspective, it's funny how much... I was going to say, I think I just see IPS everywhere, and I see VA less and less. I feel like IPS is just going to be the budget standard. OLED is going to probably become more common if they deem us worthy of getting it for a reasonable price in the monitor space. And then micro LED, I don't know. Where's self-driving cars? They're not everywhere by 2020 either. So we'll see when that comes. They probably will come, but I don't know when micro LED will be standard. Tired Gaming Dad writes in. He says, "Hello, TNT. I couldn't pass up asking Tim some thoughts on monitor solutions for my specific needs. I suffer from simulation sickness with many first-person shooters like Minecraft, BioShock Infinite, Doom 2016, and Gears 5, to name a few. The only things that seem to help me is reducing screen tearing and dropped frames as much as possible, and being able to adjust mouse acceleration to a very slow rate and disable motion blur. Even then, though, I still can't play many games I would like to enjoy for more than about 30 minutes. I did upgrade to a mid-range 1440p 140Hz IPS with G-Sync from a low-end 1080p 60Hz TN panel. It's quite an upgrade. And notice that it did help some, especially when combined with a gamepad allowing me to sit further away from the screen. But I'm just wondering if an OLED may help with my issues, or if some other panel technology, VA, even higher refresh rate, something. Are there certain features, Tim, that you think I should be looking for that would help minimize my motion sickness issues?"
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I can't speak from my experience as someone that doesn't suffer from simulation sickness, so I don't really have great insights here. But I think if things like reducing screen tearing and drop frames and the move to a high refresh rate panel have helped, then you'd probably just want to keep going down that path to something perhaps even higher refresh rate. You'll certainly reduce a lot of the motion blur type effects that may be affecting you, if that's a significant issue for you. So, moving to 240 hertz, I would think would be a natural step there. I think with OLED, you sort of, you get speed in sort of a different way. It's not necessarily going to be the smoothness of frames, no dropped frames or less motion blur. But with OLED, you obviously get shorter response times. But then often, if the refresh rate isn't high enough, you start getting the sort of OLED judder that you might see if you've had an OLED TV and you're playing like movies, for example, where in motion it kind of like does this judder motion, which may be an issue if you're playing games on hardware that can't run at 144 FPS. So I probably wouldn't say OLED is going to be the best solution for you unless there's some major high refresh rate OLED in the future. But I think, if you keep going down the path to getting really low latency displays with lots of frames getting pumped into it and the smoothness there, then possibly that's going to help you. But again, I'm not a medical expert, so I don't know for sure what the cause of something like this is. So, but yeah, those are sort of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think I suffer from very little motion sickness when it comes to anything having to do with a video game, which is weird because I get easily seasick and I hate being in the backseat of a car. So
yeah, same. Yeah.
And then my brother never gets seasick, but he got sick playing Mirror's Edge. And he said that he hated being in computer labs in school because back then they had CRT monitors, and he said they just fundamentally give him headaches.
Yeah, I think that would be the flicker-related issue, which again, maybe for this person, it is a flicker-related issue, especially if you had an old monitor. A lot of them did not use flicker-free backlights. Like, they would use PWM for their backlight technology, which is less of an issue these days. So potentially that's another area where you'd see some benefits. Obviously, CRTs are horrible for that, and so is running monitors with backlight strobing enabled. But lots of today's monitors have, no PWM issues. Then again, there's some that run their PWM at like 10 kilohertz. So it can be, it can be a bit of a process to find the one that works for you. But that's something I have heard a lot of people say with other monitors, that, they get something, then there's a little bit of a backlight flicker and it makes them feel really sick using it. So just one of those things I guess you got to check the reviews for.
Yeah, I guess this is a person that the highest refresh you can get a decent graphics card and turn settings down and get locked adaptive sync is probably a godsend for you too, and that it actually is putting out the frames when they're supposed to come out. Well, on the subject of high refresh, TMC Payton writes in, he says, "Howdy, Tim and Tom. How does your desktop build recommendations change for buyers, not guyers, gaming exclusively on 240 hertz monitors? Both of you all do amazing work. Thank you." Geez, I stumbled through that question, but I think you understood what he was asking.
Look, with this one, it's always one of those it depends questions, right? Because there are people that buy 240 hertz monitors and don't really use the 240 hertz. Like they still play mostly their single player games, in which case, your recommendations might be a bit different. But if we assume that most people buying this sort of monitor are sort of your esports type gamers that are playing competitive games, they want the low latency and all of those things, then, I think you'd probably try and put more focus onto the CPU than the GPU. Previously, if you were buying, for example, the fastest GPU you could possibly get and sort of neglecting the CPU, at 240 hertz, you're going to run into a lot of CPU related issues a lot of the time, especially if you wanted to run, and this is something I was thinking about the other day, like especially if you want to run single player games at really high frame rates. Like if you want to run Cyberpunk at a super high frame rate, it's really, really difficult. Even if you have a super powerful GPU and you turn all the settings down, you're pretty much going to be CPU limited quite quickly. So I think getting something that's as powerful of a CPU that you can is going to help a lot with those sorts of monitors. But then again, like I said, it sort of depends on what you're using that monitor for. You can get a lot of benefits from 240 hertz for desktop use, even if you're not using that for gaming. So I guess it just depends.
One thing that I remember you, and especially Steve on Hardware Unboxed, covered in a lot of detail, I want to say like half a year ago or so, was the CPU bottlenecking issue with high-end Ampere cards versus RDNA 2 cards. I recently tested a 6700 XT again against the 3070, and I found similar results to Steve at Hardware Unboxed, where if anything, Ampere's gained performance in 4K over the 6700 XT year over year. But then in 1080p, I found some pretty huge bottlenecking walls in CPU performance, even with an Alder Lake CPU, with the 3070 that I did not have with the 6700 XT, a couple of games had radically higher frame rates in 1080p, which really, even if it's been covered before, did surprise me when I saw it in person. Would you recommend, because I think if you're gaming at 240 hertz, like let's just say it, you're going to turn down settings. Like you are.
Yeah.
So, like, would
Yeah.
you recommend an RDNA 2 APU or GPU more likely over an Ampere one if they're targeting that type of resolution? Because I'd say you're just not playing with ray tracing on, so why do you even care about Ampere?
Yeah, I'd say that's probably a fair comment. Obviously, it goes to the pricing of those GPUs, which at the moment is also in favor of the RDNA 2 cards. But I think, yeah, if you are playing at 1080p or even 1440p, obviously there's 240 Hz 1440p today as well, then yeah, you probably would want that sort of GPU, especially if you're playing DirectX 12 games, which I think was most of the bottlenecking issue between the two, sort of the driver overhead discussion from last year. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what you want to go with. But then again, if you're sort of mixing and matching between all sorts of different types of gaming, then maybe you'd go NVIDIA. But I think, yeah, mostly if you were sort of lower resolution, low quality settings gaming, then yeah, get your super fast CPU if at all possible. And then, yeah, probably get an RDNA 2 product.
So Temet Nos writes in and he says, "What's up, Tim and Tom? Tim, as someone who's familiar with calibration on displays and such, I'm sure you've encountered diehard picture quality enthusiasts such as myself. For instance, once I got into the high-end TV arena and began to learn about calibration techniques, I realized that I was in agreement with most of the experts who claim that anything that alters the native resolution degrades the overall experience. This is why whenever I set up a new panel, I always turn off all processing such as upscaling, motion reduction, etc. The idea being that you can't simply get data from nothing, so any kind of upscaling is basically just filler data. My question is, what is your opinion on these ideas in relation to DLSS and FSR? The general way I see it is get the hardware to handle the resolution you're actually trying to target. Thanks to you, Tom, Steve, and of course Stan, and hopefully Tim, and all the hard work you do. Tim, you were my go-to when making my decision for purchasing the LG 27GL 850-B 2 years ago, and it's been a fantastic panel so far."
Yeah, look, quite a question here. Probably a fair bit to discuss on this one. I'm certainly a more of the die-hard picture quality enthusiast when it comes to things like TVs and stuff. You know, I always also turn off all of the processing stuff, all the motion reduction and the denoising, all that stuff gets turned off straight away for me. I think when it comes to DLSS and FSR, it kind of comes from a sort of a different standpoint. I think with the reason why you'd want to turn off all that processing stuff on your TV or monitor is when you're watching, like, say, a movie, for example, you want to get the experience that the person that made the film has intended. Like, there's someone employed making the film who does all the color work and all the mastering and everything to make it look exactly how the filmmaker wants that to look. So, for example, some films use film grain as sort of an artistic element, and you wouldn't want to have your TV remove that because it's actually part of what the film is meant to be, especially for things like horror films as an example. So I think with DLSS and FSR, it's kind of more acceptable to use, I guess, because it's a feature that the developer of the game is implementing. It's not something that a user is sort of forcing on the game. Like, anyone that's implementing those features, the developer's choosing to do that. They're saying this is an acceptable way to run the game. So I think from that perspective, it kind of is okay to use DLSS and FSR. I don't really see it the same as turning on the TV processing features where you're just sort of, you're making the choice about how things should look. You kind of, it's sort of a developer sanctioned thing. I think with films, if there were, different quality options to watch a film, then all of those different quality options would be acceptable. But obviously that's not the way that films work. So yeah, I think, again, sort of if it comes down to upscaling on a TV versus upscaling in a game, I think, the game option is more acceptable because the developers are sort of saying, go ahead, do that.
Yeah, when I hear these questions, two things come to mind. The first one is, we're just so far away from perfect image quality still. I mean, it's not like audio in the 70s where you've got like an A track and anything you could do to make the audio sound better, please. I mean, cassette tape sounded horrible. But over time, I think a reason, and like when I look at different file sizes, because I have to edit and manage a lot of audio myself, and I look at like some of these WAV files that take up 5 gigabytes versus, something that takes up, 100, 200 megabytes. Or, I mean, sometimes the difference is like 100 megabytes versus 5 or 10 for a song. And this isn't like an MP3 that's like a low bit rate. We're talking like 320, like really high bit rate MP3 is like a tenth the size of completely entirely lossless audio. I feel like we're maybe going to get there with graphics cards in 5 years, maybe. And that's when you'll start turning into this debate of, I really think a lot of PC gamers are going to sound a lot like what audio enthusiasts do now, where they're like, oh, I all lossless image quality. I've got my $5,000 system. I can tell the difference between this and DLSS 3.0. Trust me. And I think most people are going to be like, looks pretty close to photorealistic to me. But I just don't think we're there yet. So there's no game I played, and I've, tested an overclocked A6000, 3080 Ti. Like I've tested the highest end GPU levels of performance, and there's always a little more performance I can get in any of the recent AAA games, no matter what. Yes, I can make do gaming in 4K on a 3070, but I would like to cut power usage in half even sometimes if it means the image quality is 5% worse. I don't really see the scenario right now where like even a 3090 Ti in 4K, you're not going to take that extra performance if you can get it.
Yeah, and I think as well, a lot of games these days, it also makes sense for using DLSS and FSR from sometimes just getting better image quality. I mean, it depends on the game. Obviously, there are some games where they look worse and there's some where they look better. But a lot of developers, they love their TAA. They love using that as the main anti-aliasing. And then they kind of botch it a lot of the times, either massive ghosting or significant amounts of like softness, blur, whatever you want to call it. So again, those are sort of reasons that you would use DLSS and FSR just to improve the image quality from a standpoint that you're not getting those issues with the sort of developer intended image. But obviously in the future, hopefully TAA overall has improved to the point where you're not sort of seeing those artifacts. And I think things like running DLSS just at the native resolution, using it as an anti-aliasing feature, and similar with FSR, will become more popular as hardware becomes faster, because then you're not as concerned about running at 120 FPS because you're already there. You're just more concerned about getting even better image quality with those features. So I think that's probably where things like that would head. But yeah, I guess it depends. Obviously, I agree. There will be sort of those audiophile type gamers in the future where they're sort of, they're zooming in and looking very closely at the fine details and stuff and nitpicking things to death. But I think for most gamers, that's probably not how most people play. I think most people sort of just accept the performance to image quality balance and go from there.
Now, let's start talking about this then. One of the main reasons I wanted to have you on this week is you've tested FSR 2.0. I mean, what's your overall opinion of it? I think it's just in Deathloop right now, but I know you tested on a bunch of different graphics cards. Like, is FSR? I mean, I don't even. There's so much we could really discuss about this, honestly, because how is FSR 1.0 actually at this point lived up to what you expected, and then is FSR 2.0 better than you expected? Like, like a year ago, we were talking about the launch, I think, of FSR 1.0.
Yeah, I think FSR 1.0, it was a good stepping stone to something better. I think a lot of what I said in the original piece that I did on FSR 1.0, however long that was ago, like a year ago, in terms of playing games at 4K ultra, using the ultra quality setting, is still true in a lot of instances. Like most games with FSR 1.0 ultra quality at 4K look good, but it really does depend on the game for sort of those lower quality settings. And I would not be wanting to use FSR 1.0 at like 1080p, for example. Like it looks quite bad, especially in games that have like lots and lots of grass, as an example, or lots of hair. Like it just doesn't deal with that very well. And I think, even at that launch, it was quite clear that DLSS was better in a lot of those circumstances. So I think when it comes to FSR 2.0 expectations, I always look at this in sort of a, not so much, what I think the company can do, but sort of what they have to do. Like FSR 2.0 had to be a lot better than FSR 1.0, and it had to get reasonably close to DLSS. Otherwise, there's no point launching it. Like AMD would just be embarrassing themselves if they launched FSR 2.0 and it was worse than what they previously had, and it was significantly behind DLSS, because people would test it and be like, this sucks. Like, why didn't you do a better job of this? So, if I sort of take that angle and sort of think, well, most companies are trying to beat their competitors or match their competitors, then the sort of expectations are at that level. So from that sense, I think FSR 2.0 was sort of at my expectation level. I think if anything, the performance on lower tier cards was perhaps a bit weaker than I was hoping for. Things like how it runs on an RX 570, that sort of class of cards. You do get a performance uplift, but we're only talking like 10 to 15%, which isn't amazing. I would have liked to have seen more of a performance uplift, but then again, you're comparing it to basically nothing. Like there's no alternative. So getting any performance uplift is better than nothing. So I guess that's sort of where I sit on my expectations for the technology. I think there's room for it to get better, but I certainly think that it sort of was at the level that I was thinking it would be.
Now, why do you think the performance uplift wasn't that big for the lower end and really just older cards?
Yeah, I think it comes down to mostly just the GPU resources that are available. The algorithm itself takes longer to run on slower cards. So, if you're processing a frame at, let's say, 4K and it takes, say 2 milliseconds on something like a 6800 XT, it may be taking 5-6 milliseconds on a slower card, and that really limits the performance that you're getting. Even if both cards you're sort of running a baseline native performance of 60 FPS, having to take a 2 millisecond hit for processing frames versus 6 milliseconds is going to really limit the performance uplift that you get for the card that takes 6 milliseconds, because it just takes so much longer to do that processing. So I think that's the sort of main limitation on those slower cards. On top of that, you'd probably, again, we don't have the full details on how FSR 2.0 works, but on those lower end cards as well, they don't necessarily have some of the features that the newer architectures have. I think the RX 570 doesn't support native FP16, and I'd be shocked if FSR 2.0 didn't use that processing pipeline, which again would be another factor for it being slower. But then we saw a similar situation on a 1650 Super, which I believe does support FP16 processing. So I think most of it is just down to slow cards are slow and can't run these effects that well. And you're sort of having to balance lowering the resolution, trying to improve the performance, having these fixed, processing effects. I think they sort of tried their best in terms of getting a performance uplift, and even getting that uplift is still okay. But I'm sure there is a point where you won't see any performance gain, like the frame time shortening that you get from reducing the resolution is perfectly counteracted by the cost it takes to do the upscaling. So I'm sure on something like maybe an RX 560, something around there, you probably wouldn't see much of a benefit.
Well, speaking of around RX 560 performance, you haven't tested FSR 2.0 on Rembrandt yet, have you?
No, I do want to take more of a look into that, but I think we're getting 6000 U series laptops pretty soon. So I think if there's any sort of APU product that it makes sense to test something like FSR 2.0, it would be that sort of tier of system. So yeah, I'll definitely check it out when that sort of thing is available, but I'm not expecting like major gains. I know people have talked about Steam Deck as well, sort of being a perfect candidate for FSR 2.0, but again, the GPU on that is fairly weak. So
no, it's not. It's enthusiast gaming on the go. Come on, 720p 30 hertz is now enthusiast.
Obviously very impressive for a portable system, but FSR 2.0 does seem reasonably demanding. So I don't expect, again, it depends. Like I haven't tested how it goes 720p, for example. So, maybe it's very lightweight there, but yeah, I wouldn't be expecting more than like 15% gains on low-end APU, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, Rembrandt's like it's weaker than a 1650 Max Q, which I usually say pegs it around a desktop 1050 Ti. I expect they're going to market their next gen APU pretty heavily with FSR 2.0, so I guess that is interesting to see where it goes. I mean, let me ask you this though: how do you feel about? And I'm going to use this first question to kind of springboard into the next one. Like, I have to ask: do you expect any different results on other games with FSR 2.0? Because I mean, technically, people like to point out this is just one game. It could be a best case scenario.
Yeah, I don't know for sure. I think it really depends on how you look at, how you expect it to be different in other games. If you're comparing it to sort of the native image quality, then the native image quality varies a lot between different games. Like some games don't use TAA at all, some games use crappy TAA, and then you get sort of your cyberpunks that the native image quality is pretty good. So if you're doing those sort of native versus upscaled comparisons, I think we're going to see quite a range of different results for FSR 2.0. You might not get the sort of better than native experience like you get in something like Deathloop. Certainly, if it's included in Cyberpunk, I don't think we'll see better than native image quality because we don't really get that with DLSS either. But if you're sort of comparing like how FSR looks to how DLSS looks, I think it'll be mostly the same because you're sort of using the same effect. Now, there may be some games where things like there's not too many grass effects or there's not too much, some of those things that really trigger FSR 2.0's, poorer performance, things like really fine details. If those aren't in the game, then you're not going to notice that being an issue. But I think if you had two games that had similar levels of things like grass, like chain link fences, those sorts of things, then I would expect FSR to DLSS to look pretty similar.
Now, what do you think AMD needs to do then with FSR 2.0? Because to be honest, they just need to get this thing frickin' adopted heavily before RDNA 3 launches, which it just sounds like such Groundhog's Day talking about FSR 1.0 and talking about how that needed to be adopted quickly. And I recently had on a game developer, Brian Heemskirk, and talked to him about like what's going on with FSR. I think this was actually around when 2.0 was announced earlier this year. And we talked about how this is an uncomfortable truth. Yes, FSR 1 is getting adopted faster than DLSS was in that, I mean, DLSS just wasn't adopted for like the first year. But in the year FSR has been out, there's been more DLSS games added than FSR games. So Nvidia is adding more games per month with DLSS than AMD is with FSR. And I think that's quite troubling. It doesn't really matter if FSR 2.0 is as good as DLSS if every game already has DLSS 2.3, and you can still make that argument of like, oh, it's 5% better or something. I mean, do you expect this to get adopted faster, or is there anything else besides adoption you think FSR needs at this point?
Yeah, I'm not sure on adoption. I think they've got a challenge here because they kind of have to adopt faster in terms of getting the previous games, like the games that have already launched. They have to sort of go through and convince developers to include this feature in those games. Those are sort of the games that make the backbone of the technology, whatever you want to say, like your Cyberpunks, Red Dead Redemption, those sort of big major titles that people go back to and talk about even today. But I think moving forward in sort of upcoming releases, it doesn't, like, they have to sort of be in the games that DLSS is in. I don't think it matters too much if they are in more games than DLSS moving forward, so long as every game that has DLSS also has FSR. And to be honest, there's no reason that they shouldn't have one of the features. There's FSR 2.0 support in major game engines, especially Unreal Engine, which the majority of games are made in these days. So if a developer is putting the work in to include DLSS and they're not including FSR 2.0, they're just missing out on addressing potential customers of them. There's still plenty of gamers out there that are playing on Pascal era GPUs where they can't use DLSS. So it makes sense to include that sort of feature for all games moving forward. I don't think there's many excuses. I mean, developers will come and say, all these features take time and effort to integrate and all that stuff. But I think if you're putting in the effort to integrate DLSS, you should be putting in the effort to integrate FSR 2.0 as well. Whether or not that happens is obviously another question. But, you know, I'm fairly hopeful that we see some movement there. Obviously, there's going to be the sort of the Nvidia-sponsored games that probably only use DLSS, and then the AMD-sponsored games, like sort of maybe a Far Cry of the future sort of thing that would only use FSR 2.0. But hopefully we see the majority of titles integrating both. And I think there'll be a fair bit of, you know, community push towards that, sort of people questioning, you know, why does this game have DLSS but not FSR 2.0? Whereas I sort of think with FSR 1.0, because the technology was so different and potentially not to the same quality level, especially for people playing like 1080p, 1440p, that you could sort of, I guess, justify a developer not wanting to bother with it if they assessed it and were like, wow, this doesn't look very good for whatever reason, then they might just dismiss it. But I don't think that applies with FSR 2.0. I think the quality is there. So I think developers testing it would find that as well. So, you know, we'll see what happens on the adoption front, but I think that probably is the main thing that they really need to nail. It's sort of, you know, obviously there's the quality side of things where they could still work on and improve it and all of that. But I just expect that to happen anyway because, you know, NVIDIA's been doing that with DLSS. AMD should be doing that with FSR 2.0. But if they want to take, you know, the lead or the crown or whatever, then, yeah, it's kind of convincing developers to integrate it, making it easy for developers to integrate, you know, providing the support. NVIDIA's very good at doing that in terms of, you know, going to developers, trying to get their features integrated into games. AMD needs to, pretty significantly step up their game there, and not just rely on their GPU open website and having a plugin for Unreal Engine. They need to be, you know, sitting down with people and making sure that their features are there.
Yeah, Rafa Zaya writes in and basically asked us too if there was like any benefit to FSR 1.0 being open source in practice. And this is actually interesting because, bringing him up again, that Brian Heemskirk episode of Broken Silicon, he said a lot of developers he works with and talked to, including himself to a certain degree, it was like, yeah, great AMD, it's easy to add FSR 1.0. Ooh, we can do it supposedly in a day of coding. But that's not how we make games. If we add it in a day of coding, we're still worried we're going to add bugs. And so ultimately, the QA part of it, the testing, making sure there isn't artifacts when we add it, that's most of the work. It's not actually adding it. And I do think at a certain point, FSR 1.0 wasn't adopted as much actually because the fact that NVIDIA was willing to pay to put DLSS in the code mid-development meant that they were always working towards including it and adding that. And devs don't want to add anything last minute. The time that they're polishing, it doesn't matter how easy it is. Like it works. Just please don't touch it is how they think about it. And so I think that whether AMD likes it or not, they're gonna have to just pay to put it in the game, man. Like you're gonna have to start fighting fire with fire here when it comes to competing with NVIDIA.
Yeah, I think so. I think the open source stuff benefits, you know, not that much, probably on a minor end. You know, developers can sort of see how the algorithm works so they can optimize the inputs to the algorithm. I'd heard that for a few people saying, you know, DLSS can be difficult in some situations to get it running perfectly because the developer doesn't know exactly how it works, so they can't make the inputs, you know, as good as they possibly could be, which is not going to be as much of an issue for FSR 2.0. But yeah, like for developers, you know, how often have we even seen DLSS 1.0 games get upgraded to DLSS 2.0? Like DLSS 2.0,
file, right?
Yeah, was like so much better than DLSS 1.0, and yet developers still didn't, like the majority of them didn't upgrade to 2.0. I know some of them have now, but we're talking like years later or after some major, you know, maybe it's like a DLC pack or a new edition of the game. That's what it takes to get those features integrated. So I agree with you. I think with FSR 2.0, it's really about integrating it early in the pipeline. I think having like an Unreal Engine 5 or 4 plugin is going to help a fair bit for that, because developers, when they begin their project, can enable the DLSS plugin, the FSR 2.0 plugin, and go about it from there. But getting it in games that are already on the market is going to take money, basically. Like going back and saying, hey, CD Projekt, Cyberpunk, hey, well, we want FSR 2.0 in your game. Here's the development resources, or however these companies, because, you know, AMD and Nvidia have always denied, at least to me, paying for these features, but they always, say we provide the development resources or whatever the alternate, which is effectively, money in some form or another. So I think they're going to have to do stuff like that. But yeah, like I said, moving forward, I think with future games, hopefully it's easy enough for the developers to integrate that they can get that process rolling early. And also that unlike FSR 1.0, there hopefully will be fewer artifacts and issues that may be off-putting to developers. Like even if early in development they integrate FSR 1.0, they might have a game that is really, really sharp and has lots of aliasing normally, in which case FSR 1.0 just amplifies that, and a developer may see that and be like, oh, I'm not super keen on how that looks. Whereas I think FSR 2.0 is going to be much more versatile for those developers, and it's going to produce results that developers will be more happy with and more happy to integrate into their game without perhaps doing as much of the quality control side of things. Obviously, they're going to have to make sure the feature works. But beyond that, I think the image quality is going to impress more developers, which is going to help with these sorts of features. You have to, when you're trying to convince someone to use something that you've made, you actually have to make it good. It's sort of like the first step is making it good. And I think FSR 2.0 does qualify as being good for that sort of purpose.
Well, yeah, and it actually is very good now. Very close to DLSS. Today's video is brought to you by CDKeyOffer.com. Now that I've got my compact Alder Lake benchmarking system done, I'm free to test a lot of graphics cards in both Windows 10 and Windows 11, and I always get those keys from CDKeyOffer.com. That's because it's a reliable, long-term sponsor of Moore's Law is Dead that gets you reasonable prices on legitimate keys for these types of products. But it's really not all that they offer. They also can give you keys for Microsoft Office, keys for PlayStation codes, and even some of the latest PC releases like Elden Ring, and they even carry gaming peripherals in chairs now. Whatever you need, CDK Offer probably has you covered, and they're always running sales, but make sure you use the best code possible, and that's the ones provided for the Moore's Law is Dead fans. Moore's Law is Dead fans get the biggest discount, and if you go to the link on screen or in the description, you can use code BROKENSILICON to get 25% off Microsoft products and DieShrink to get 3% off everything else on the website. Using these codes really does help Moore's Law is Dead, and it helps you pay reasonable prices for games that you want and keys that, frankly, you just have to use half of the time. So, again, use the link in the description, use Broken Silicon, use DieShrink depending on the products you're getting, and pay reasonable prices for keys today at CDKeyOffer.com. Amiable Chief writes in and he says, "Hi guys, I don't think I've seen anyone frame it quite like this, but in light of FSR 2.0, do you feel like DLSS is starting to look a little Rubegoldberg-esque? Achieving DLSS-like quality without AI or running out of the box on the competition seems like the more elegant engineering solution, and at least in my opinion makes NVIDIA look a little silly. And that is to say nothing of the power draw. AMD seems to have iterated more rapidly with FSR 2.0, so do you agree with this idea? And finally, do you see AMD blowing it out of the water with hardware accelerated FSR, he calls it 2.5, they'd probably call it 3.0, and RDNA 4?
Yeah, I got no idea whether the FSR 3.0 being accelerated thing is ever going to happen, so don't know about that. I think for the, DLSS taking the AI approach versus FSR doing the, what do they call it, handcrafted algorithm or whatever sort of marketing they want to use for it, the normal algorithm way of doing things. You can sort of say that, yes, doing AI-based stuff without AI is potentially more impressive, but then you also look at how long it took them to actually do it. So NVIDIA had DLSS 2.0 ready, in like the start of 2020, so at least 2 years ago now. And AMD took 2 years to develop their handcrafted. I don't know if they were working on it for 2 years. I've got no idea. They could have only been working on it for 6 months for all I know. They should have been working on it for years at the very least, as soon as DLSS 2.0 was announced. But, because they're later to develop this, you sort of, I guess there's ways of going about it. Often the reason for using AI is to simplify the development of very complicated algorithms. Like if you can do it via AI, yes, it may be more complex in terms of what the AI produces for you. It may run worse or whatever, not that DLSS does. But, you're sort of simplifying, trying to figure out the exact inputs and the exact tweaks that make the best image quality. Whereas if you're doing it the non-AI way, you have to pay someone to spend hours upon hours going through and optimizing all the little things, that may go wrong across a wide variety of games. So, I think it's impressive that FSR 2.0 gets as close to DLSS as it does without AI. But DLSS at the end of the day also, in my opinion, does look better, and it uses AI. And I think the benefits for things like playing at 1080p, using the lower quality settings, it is better with the AI approach. So, how much can you criticize someone using AI for a technology when they have actually made sort of the better technology at the end of the day? But then again, you're sort of talking about better from one perspective, because better may mean supported across a wide range of hardware, which DLSS isn't capable of doing. So I think with these discussions, there's just far too many angles to sort of say, one company took the best approach or the other company took the best approach. I think that, FSR 2.0 being the more supported option, that's definitely a great way of going about it. But then also creating the way that looks the best is a great way of going about it, even if it creates, more hardware compatibility issues. So I don't know really where I sit on that. I certainly think that FSR 2.0 has more room to be optimized. I think that this isn't the end of where the hand-tuned algorithm could be. I think it could definitely get closer to DLSS over time, and DLSS is sort of perhaps more at the end of the sort of level of quality that it can achieve. But I guess it just depends how much effort they want to put into achieving that. I certainly, there's no reason why the AI algorithm can't be replicated via hand-tuned algorithms. It's just a matter of finding that algorithm by hand that works as well, which may take quite a lot of time.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's too early to say DLSS is Rubegoldberg-esque, but maybe an FSR 3.0 comes out that beats it and then does work on all hardware, and we're like, it's starting to look kind of silly at this point, Jensen, especially when you look at G-Sync, where that did look Rubegoldberg-esque to me. It's like, look at this chip that adds power usage and latency and cost to the monitor and thickness.
Yeah, and I think with those things, it's about how the company that makes the Rubegoldberg-esque, product, however you want to, label that. I think it's about how they go about making the final product, because obviously the gold standard would be DLSS that works on everything, right? Like, that's what people want. They want the compatibility and the image quality in the one thing. So I think, if FSR starts getting closer and closer to DLSS, and DLSS, Nvidia is like, hey, we're not going to put any effort in whatsoever to make this work on anything else. Like, we just don't care. We're not going to put in the effort. Then that's when they start looking more down that path of the Rubegoldberg-esque, because they're not putting in the development effort to try and fix one of the issues of DLSS, which is the compatibility. But I think, if they come up with a technology that, like DLSS, that is more compatible, then they sort of get out of that mentality, I guess, where they sort of go from, hey, this is the way we could do it to begin with, and we focused on image quality, and we got the image quality that we were after, and then over time we put in the development effort to make it more compatible, to run on more things, to do that broad support. Will Nvidia do that? Well, they've told me that they're not doing that, so I doubt that they will, but I think that's the sort of path out of looking like that. Whether or not Nvidia actually cares about looking like having made this extremely complicated AI system that only runs on their hardware, I don't think they care all that much. They care about having the best feature, and that's sort of the limit of where they cut it off. They don't care about it running on their competitors. So I think I think there may be a point where DLSS needs to go to a wide support to become the best feature on the market, if FSR 2.0 can get there with quality, or FSR 3.0. But it just depends on how they approach the development.
Yeah, I mean, I think they don't need to do that until AMD forces their hand in FSR 2.0
absolutely,
in one game. So I think, and it's actually funny, to answer part of Amiel Chief's question, which is I never actually confirmed it was going to happen, but I did suspect AMD may someday try to accelerate FSR if it gets widespread adoption. But they need to get the adoption first before they try to have some advantage, because if they were to take FSR 2.0 right now and say it only runs on RDNA 3 or an RDNA 2 and RDNA 3 gets a boost, developers are going to be like, yeah, well, whatever. Nvidia has 80% market share, so maybe we'll support it if you pay us to. I've actually heard that there might be some slight amount of silicon in RDNA 3 or like that was going to accelerate it, but they found it was totally unnecessary to get basically maximum performance. And if they don't have adoption, what is the point on forcing some unique feature? And they need that first. So I don't actually expect any sort of accelerated. I'm almost 100% sure you're not going to see that in RDNA 3 at this point, actually. I don't expect to see it until they get widespread adoption. And then that's when they can try to pull in Nvidia. But I don't think there's not going to be any developer buying if they do it too soon.
Yeah, and I think with these features as well, we don't know what's going to happen with things like, game engine support for similar features. Like there may be a future where, we hit another Unreal Engine version and their version of TSR suddenly is extremely excellent. I know it's supposed to be very good. I haven't done a ton of investigating into that because of obviously the lack of Unreal Engine 5 games you can actually play the night tech demos, but I think with, there's possibly the game engine solve that problem for these companies so that they don't necessarily need to bother with these, hardware accelerating effects and stuff. You're sort of running a very fine line with the hardware acceleration thing where if you're spending money to develop a hardware feature and you're allocating die space to do that, you have to make sure the feature is actually used widely and isn't going to die away and just make that silicon investment pointless. I think AMD in the past has done stuff back, like True Audio, where they have this hardware accelerated audio features and things, and they're like, hey, developers, please use this. And then no one did. So that kind of effort is wasted. But yeah, I think by the time we get to the future where FSR is integrated into enough games that it warrants hardware acceleration, there's probably going to be too many upscaling methods available that you wouldn't really bother with trying to accelerate your thing, because there'd be just games using one feature, another game using a different feature, a third game using a third different feature, and it just wouldn't make sense at that point.
Yeah, it'd almost be better actually if what you did in some future RDNA is some sort of neural engine-esque accelerated thing where it's we can use this neural engine to accelerate not just FSR, but all these other upscaling techniques in the back end, and it can be used for other stuff that's not gaming. But if they had an IP block for just one use, that'd be a huge waste of silicon if it's just one use, especially, when you consider even just 10 millimeters squared, 20, 30 millimeters squared, well, we could add a few more compute units. We could add 32, another 10, 20 megabytes of infinity cache. We could add another 32 bits to the bus width. There's always something else or you can make the die 10% smaller and increase yields by a few percent, make more money. There's always something else you can do with that space.
Yeah, and I think if they were going to go down the path of acceleration, they'd want their own first-party feature that is really compelling. I think back to the True Audio example, True Audio wasn't that compelling. There wasn't. They sort of tried to make it out that it was doing all these cool audio things, but the difference was negligible to very minor. I think if they were going to do the acceleration path, they would have to develop their own DLSS-like feature. Of course, and I don't mean that from another upscaling technology. I mean a feature that is compelling enough for gamers like DLSS is. And I think one angle that they could go down, which it probably isn't going to be relevant for at least maybe 5 years or something like that, is once we start getting 500 hertz to 1000 hertz displays that are really, really high refresh rate, the only feasible path to using those displays is AI frame interpolation, where you're technically running the game at 200 FPS, but then you use AI magic to double that to 400 FPS, or you quadruple that to 800 FPS to run on your 1000 hertz display. I think I would be shocked if Nvidia isn't actively developing features like that.
Yeah.
So I think because 1000 hertz displays are on the development pipeline for panel manufacturers. So I think, the company that comes out and can do that sort of acceleration, something like that sort of feature where gamers can immediately see the benefit of using it, where, it theoretically would run in many different games. It would immediately give you, sort of a doubling of your frame rate. It's kind of like a fake doubling, motion smoothing type effect with TVs, but obviously far superior because you're doing it with AI. I think those sorts of things, that's where you can justify the hardware costs and the hardware acceleration stuff. But if you're just producing a feature that you need game developers to support, and you've got 20% market share and your feature is exclusive, and you're initially point some fraction of a decimal of the market is going to have your new GPU that supports that feature, it's going to be very difficult.
What do you mean? True Audio's in Thief,
Yeah, wow. Amazing. So I think they struggle with that. And, even with DLSS, it took, how many years before developers started integrating that? Because, Turing, obviously, when it launches, no one has those cards, so no developers would bother unless there's some other incentive. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, too, because 4K 240 hertz is on the horizon. You can technically, they're somewhat experimental, but you can get 480 hertz monitors right now if you want to from a company that makes a chip that does it. So and I know the way AMD's going with these insane mega just Ponte Vecchio looking chiplet GPUs a few years from now. I don't know if Nvidia's really caught up in the chiplet game. We'll have to see, but that is a killer feature that if they were like, hey, double frame rate now, effectively. All of our cards just doubled frame rate because of this tensor accelerated IP block we added. That is the logical conclusion I could see them going to with giant monolithic dies to combat these complex chiplet things AMD has. It is, and I do find it surprising these companies haven't done something with that when it comes to anti-aliasing or some dedicated IP block yet. It really does actually still surprise me that they really haven't tried that.
Yeah, I think at least for the sort of frame interpolation thing, we don't really have the displays yet, at least in my opinion, that would justify that, because
not
you really do want
you
do want a very short time between frames to sort of, you don't want to having to do 30 FPS to 60 FPS interpolation, because then you get the TV soap opera effect, which the quality of that can be a bit hit or miss. But if you're talking about having a 1 millisecond or 2 millisecond sort of time that you have to sort of work with, then that would really benefit those sorts of features. So I think when it comes to accelerating something like that, I guess you need the other parts of the ecosystem to improve in terms of displays. And can you run 1000 hertz on a current display connector? Maybe at 1080p, but certainly not at higher resolutions without some sort of compression technology. So I think that's why we wouldn't see that. But yeah, I think it is maybe a little bit strange why we haven't seen accelerated anti-aliasing as a feature. But I guess I'm not a hardware developer, so I don't know, maybe that's not really possible to be done, or would require some ridiculous buy-in from game developers to all use some specific AI anti-aliasing technique. I don't know, but I think there's probably, clearly the way hardware is being developed further into the future are more and more hardware accelerated features. Media encoding was sort of the first main step towards that, and we're seeing more sort of AI features. And in the future, I'm sure there'll be more and more of those blocks included in these pieces of hardware.
Yeah, I guess another detractor is also competition. Nvidia has been in charge for a while. AMD's certainly resurgent now, but it's hey, look, half of the cards sold are going to be used for compute and data center and mining. So we don't really need that MSAA block if we're, if it's used for that, and AMD's behind us anyways. But let me switch gears to a different company here. Brett Summers writes in, he says, hello, Tom and Tim. Now that we have FSR 1.0, 2.0, RSR, DLSS 2.x, and NIS, where do you expect Intel's Xe super sampling to fit into this spectrum? It seems it's coming out May 20th, and by the wording, it seems like it's based on SM 6.4 instead of DP4A or XMX. Do you guys think we'll see quicker adoption of this compared to, say, FSR? Or do you think FSR 2.0 is good enough and is open to all vendors and backed by a company that has decades of experience in the GPU space, so it'll be better backed than what Intel is bringing? I linked a link below for you guys in case you're wondering where I got the May 20th. Yeah, so I guess that's a rumor. I don't know if you can confirm if you'll be testing XE Super sampling, and that'd be a few days from now, actually.
No, I won't be. The main reason for that is that, I've saw the May 20th date as much as everyone else did, or when everyone else did. Intel, I guess, if they are putting it out in that game on May 20th, they certainly haven't told me, which, probably if they are, they probably should be. But again, with these technologies, some companies decide not to pre-brief or provide early access for those things, so that may happen. I don't know. The last time Intel spoke to me about XeSS, they said it would only work on their own GPUs to begin with. So I don't know whether that's going to be the case with this game. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to launch. I mean, I guess there's now a few Arc laptops out there.
What do you mean? It launched last quarter, Tim.
There's one laptop, maybe?
One in Korea,
something like that, which maybe that's why they're not talking about it too much. But I think if you're coming out with a feature like XeSS, you should be making a big song and dance about it. It's a major feature that's going to be there for your GPU. So I don't know what's going to be happening with this game on May 20th. If there is XeSS in it, then I'll check it out. But no, I'm not testing it to begin with, at least at the moment. So I don't know. Maybe other people are. Maybe I've just been shafted here. Who knows?
Well, I'll jump in and say this. I've seen from some distributors, I won't, of course, say which businesses, but in their systems, I've seen screenshots of them being prepared for sale. So I will actually say that within 2 weeks of this podcast coming out, there should be some low-end Arc laptops you can actually buy at Amazon, Newegg, Micro Center, and Best Buy. Yeah. About under 2 weeks from now. I'm guessing you haven't been told you're going to be sent anytime soon or something, or if you can say or not. So if they are, they're certainly not doing a good job partnering for the testing. Then even if I know they are coming in 2 weeks, how many we'll see?
Yeah, I mean, there's a laptop that's already out there with it. So, I mean, if they wanted to if Intel wanted to have people testing it, then I'm sure that they would be doing something around that. But yeah, I don't know what they're doing with that. It's kind of an odd launch, the whole Arc thing. It is
definitely an odd launch.
Very strangely. And I've got no idea what's going to be happening with XeSS with the game,
fits in, or
whether it's in the game, how it fits in, whether it actually will work on other GPUs at launch or not. Very, very mixed messaging. I think with Intel features in games, they haven't really had much success in the past. There's been other features that they've developed previously, sort of in the Nvidia GameWorks type mold, where they've come out with their own whatever graphical effects for games. It gets integrated in 3 games in total. I know they're saying for XeSS they're going to get it in more than 3 games. I think the last they announced these things, it was they showed off a dozen games or something around there. But that's always been their issue. It doesn't really matter what how the technology looks like and how it performs and all that. It's about convincing developers to use a feature from a company that doesn't really have the history in GPUs and in gaming GPUs in particular. So I don't know what it's going to look like or how it's going to perform. I've got no idea. Hopefully it's going to be good. They claim it's AI enhanced and all that sort of thing. So we'll see how that goes from a quality performance standpoint. Fingers crossed it works well across a wide variety of GPUs, but ultimately, we'll have to it all comes down to how Intel can implement that in the games that they want to get it into, and getting into a wide variety of games, because like I said, they kind of don't have the history of being able to do that. So we'll see.
So yeah, if it launches in a week or something, you have no idea what to expect out of it. But fingers crossed.
No idea. Yeah, like I said, haven't started testing it, haven't been briefed on it or anything. So if they're doing something, we'll just be getting it at the same time as everyone else, and we'll go about doing our analysis as always. But yeah, like with these features, hopefully it's available for everyone to test out. Something like FSR 2.0, it's great that people can just go and use it and come to their own conclusions about what it's like. Obviously, the videos do help a little bit. You can see the comparisons that are maybe a bit trickier for people to do. But at the end of the day, it's like you can decide for yourself. Like there's no barrier to entry for running FSR 2.0, and hopefully there's no barrier for entry for running XeSS either. So you can just compare it yourself and go about it like that.
Well, so I guess that we're on this subject of Intel. Just we talked about Alchemist like half a year ago, and I think we would have both. I don't know if I think we would have bet money that it would be much easier to get in the U.S. by now. Like we had, if you were to tell me, hey, guess what? I would have probably believed my future self, but if he said, hey, guess what? I know you think it's coming out in 3 months, or that Intel literally told investors it was, guess what? It's going to be May, and it's still not going to be really out. Like, what do you think about Alchemist right now? It's a very open-ended question. What do you expect at this point?
Oh, don't know what I would expect. I think my expectations are probably getting lower and lower as each month goes on. I think the launch has been a bit of a fail so far. I think it's sort of, they're in this issue where it doesn't look like they're competing with high-end GPUs of today. Like they're not going to be coming out and producing an RTX 3090 type GPU as far as most people. Let's trust the rumors for a moment and say that's not going to happen. It seems very unlikely that that's going to happen. And the longer they take to get it out, the closer they're running into next generation products. And if they're launching, a 3070 type GPU up against next generation products, they just would have completely missed the boat there. The time that Alchemist needed to have launched was when GPU supplies were at their absolute worst. So
January would have been great.
Yeah, ideally even before January, like holiday of last year, would have been the sort of the optimal time to launch that. They would have had the best opportunity of getting these cards into the hands of gamers and really kicking off their ecosystem with a bang, because people were scrambling to find GPUs. If you could find Intel GPU, people would be much more willing to take the punt on a first generation product from Intel. Whereas now we're sort of sitting around and we're waiting, we're sort of twiddling our thumbs. They say it was coming out in Q1. Obviously that didn't, maybe it technically happened.
They said on shelves in Q1. And I remember in a video, I circled that and I said, on shelves Q1, comma, first generation with desktops. And I'm like, they didn't say, everyone called me pedantic. I'm like, they said on shelves. I guarantee they're using this to hide that it's not really launching then.
Yeah, well, whatever they were saying was obviously highly misleading.
Oh, yeah.
in some way. Like, obviously for, these companies, they always try and weasel out with technicalities by doing paper launches on like the very last day of the quarter so they can say it technically launched. But whatever the case is, you can't actually buy them right now. And when they were, claiming that it should have been earlier this year, that's just, it doesn't give you great confidence in a product if they keep trying to weasel out of the timeframes that they've been talking about, because it seemed, even if they were always planning on actually getting it out in July or June or whenever the time will end up being, it feels like a delay. If they say it's Q1 and then you can actually buy it in 3 or 4 months later, it feels like a delay. And delays usually, at least for hardware, don't give you heaps of confidence. Certainly with most AMD and Nvidia GPUs, they come out, they say when the product's going to be available, and maybe they say this is going to be Q3 and they launch it the very last day of September, but they tend to be more accurate with those things. So I sort of, over time, I think my expectations for the product have gotten less and less. And if they're launching even 2-3 months before next generation products, it's just they just will have completely missed a trick there. Like, it's just not going to go well for them, I wouldn't have thought.
I truly think that's what's going to happen at this point, to be honest. I think I guess we kind of have low-end laptop Alchemist out now. At first, it had like 50% GPU usage in a lot of testing. Now they've updated it. I saw it some websites, and the newest graphics driver update massively increased performance. So it seems like it is indeed the drivers. They're trying to fix the drivers to fully take advantage of their cards, and they don't see a point in, because as far as I'm aware, they're done making the cards. Like, they're just sitting the dies in a warehouse somewhere waiting to be packaged and sold. So they don't see a point in selling the highest end model if it's going to be at 70% GPU usage. And I really think we're going to see, a trickling of laptop products this month, and then in June, low end and mid range, what they'll call mid range. At this point, it'll almost be low end because Lovelace is almost out. Desktop, and I think there's going to be like a limited edition, almost like Vega Frontier-esque, which is funny because Roger Kadori's in charge again. A like Vega Frontier-esque launch of the highest end model. I honestly think like July, and it'll be like there's 2 weeks where it's even really sold, and then they kind of walk away until Battle Mage. And I think they're going to launch it like a month or weeks before Lovelace. I honestly do at this point.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have a better idea on the timelines than I would on those sorts of things. But I think, I mean, they're kind of stuck in this place where if you're producing a GPU series, like a new GPU series, you need it to be impressive off the bat. Otherwise, people, in the gaming market will create memes and laugh at them, basically. So, and we've seen that in the past with AMD launches where they've, something like the 5700 XT series where that was their top end card, and Nvidia had their flagship GPU that was significantly faster. And first of all, you don't really want that situation because then it makes it seem like the best you can do is significantly inferior to your competition. So you get memes and you get laughed at based on that. But then, even if they do come out with a product that is slower, and then they could, if they're having all these issues with drivers, it's just another compounding problem for them where they don't have the hardware that competes at the high end, and people that do actually buy their mid-range or more affordable cards, and they could price it low, like they could make it
I think
like
they're
a 5700
selling
XT.
some of them at cost because they're only making $4 million, and they know that it's more important to not be overpriced, and they've taken too long. So I think they might sell the low end one for $150, the 3060 competitor for $300 to $350, and I mean, let's just be honest. I think they should sell the 3070 competitor for $400 at most if it launches right before Lovelace.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it has to be significantly cheaper. Like today when it's very easy to buy a GPU, and obviously, we're not getting MSRP prices for every product just yet, but it's extremely easy. Like there's no barrier for supply these days. You can buy anything that you want. And I think if people have the choice, they're not going to choose to buy a first generation Intel GPU until people are telling you whether it's a good quality product or not, whether it works across a wide variety of games. So they're stuck in this really difficult position where if drivers are an issue, they can't just launch a product with terrible drivers because even today people talk about AMD versus Nvidia drivers and how good are AMD drivers. That's been an issue for quite a while. Even if in my opinion the AMD drivers are perfectly acceptable, like there's no major issues for most current gen products with AMD drivers. Obviously, it has been an issue in the past for some products. They don't want to have that reputation. Like, it's a terrible reputation to start off with. People talk about drivers all the time. They talk about compatibility. They talk about stability and features and all that. And you can't just come out and launch a slower card for, even if it's sold at cost, that just doesn't work in games and has issues. People aren't going to put up with that. They're not going to buy the future products that may actually be good. Like the next generation of GPUs from Intel, who knows, they might actually be really good. But people aren't going to buy them if the first gen has set such a terrible standard. And again, the longer they try and fix the drivers, the more of the issue on their flagship product being slower than the competition, that becomes an issue. So they're kind of stuck in this really difficult balancing act. And ultimately, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for them to come out with a product that, satisfies people. Because if they're doing what you say and they launch a month or weeks before NVIDIA's next-gen GPUs, even if it looks acceptable at the time that it launches and reviews come out, just think of the memes that would come out like 2 weeks later. Like it just wouldn't be, Intel wouldn't want to cop that, I don't think.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I need to be clear. I mean, like a month or weeks before Lovelace is, I put in quotes, launched. It's not really going to be launched for about a month after it's launched.
Yeah, like the announcement, right? But even if they come out and announce an RTX 4090 or whatever that's massively faster, people will start making the comparisons to Intel and AMD's best cards. And if Intel's best card suddenly starts looking like a mainstream GPU...
Well, I mean, I think Lovelace is going to double performance. So if the 4090 is double a 3090, and then we look at where everything else should be in that lineup, that means you're looking at a 4070 as strong or stronger than a 3090. You're looking at a 4060 about as strong probably as a 3080 or 3070 Ti. And then you're looking at a 4050 Ti, maybe about as strong as a 3070. So I don't even know how low they can price these cards if they don't sell them at cost. I honestly just think, the best you can hope for out of Intel at this point is just the drivers are rock solid. And then it's just 150, 300, or like 250 and 350. They're only making 4 million of them. Just don't leave a bad taste in everyone's mouth. And no one will hate you. But I think that's the best case scenario.
And there's nothing wrong with launching entry-level GPUs. Like, people need entry-level GPUs. Even today, the options below $250 are pretty weak. 6500 XT is not a great product. But obviously,
it's
in the past,
when
AMD's
its competitor is like a 1650.
Well, yeah, I think. But in the past, obviously, AMD's had a lot of success with cards. Well, I don't know. Should I say a lot of success? Their sales still weren't amazing, but an RX 570, 580, 480, those cards were really good for people buying entry-level, mainstream-level GPUs. And if Intel can come out and satisfy gamers looking for something for $150 to $200, for those people, it doesn't really matter if their high-end GPU isn't anywhere near the performance of their competitors. It really just comes down to the price. And that's one way that they could be successful. But unfortunately, in these eras where people like to, take their team to war against the other teams, they try and, fanboys of companies and stuff, which we've always talked about as being not a great situation. You should always be open to all the different vendors that are out there. But obviously these days there are people that, go into battle for these things, go into battle for companies for whatever reason, and not having your high-end product, hurts that perception, and hurts mindshare. So yeah, I guess that's where I'm sort of sitting on Intel GPUs at the moment. I'm just hoping that at the very least, like we've been talking about, that they do have some, sub $300 GPU that's good, competitive, and is worth buying, and gives an option to those gamers that, let's be honest, people buying GPUs below $300 in the last 5 years have been absolutely shafted. Like, they've had the consistently terrible launches, minimum price to performance improvements. So anything that helps out those people is going to be potentially good. But we'll just have to wait and see, I guess.
Yeah, it's funny to see, like, at a recent, I say recent, at some point, it could have been a year ago by now, time just flies. Nvidia did a presentation where they're like, Ampere is so popular that people are upgrading to higher tiers this gen. And I'm like, yeah, that's their only option, is to upgrade to higher tiers, guys. Don't brag about it. But of course, I'm sure investors were like, oh, wow. But I will say the final, like, devil's advocate I could argue for Intel, which they have to be thinking in the back of their mind too, is maybe Lovelace launches Q3, but that's the 4090 and like 4080. That's not the 4050 Ti, and their mobile cards probably won't be out till early next year. So there's still a realm they can occupy. And I know for a fact that AMD's cards they're launching is Navi 33 and 31 late this year, and that's going to start at $400 at the minimum for those cards. So we're talking about Nvidia and AMD are just going to ignore the sub $400 market this year. So maybe, if Intel really is, so we say, charitable because they have to be, at least they'll occupy a space that Nvidia and AMD are already planning to just ignore until next year.
Yeah, and I mean, hopefully for sub $400 buys, there'll be current generation cards now, but obviously last generation cards in the future, if you know what I mean. Like, we're talking still selling RDNA 2 and Ampere cards when next generation launches. Hopefully that's something that continues. I mean, Nvidia did do that with, they continued to sell the 16 series for quite a while until they had more and more products occupying that market. Obviously, supply issues made it quite difficult to still buy those cards, but they were technically still, the current gen option for people wanting to buy. So hopefully that continues, and maybe there's going to be some option for Intel there, but then AMD and Nvidia would theoretically have the option of lowering prices if there tends to be a lot of competition there, which may create all sorts of problems. But anyway, I think it's going to be quite competitive hopefully across the whole stack moving forward. Used GPUs hopefully will start becoming more of a factor to push down pricing, as mining is effectively not really that relevant anymore these days. So hopefully at some point we start seeing more of those cards flood in, and that's going to improve the situation for everyone and create more competition, hopefully, at least.
So switching gears, Mustang 3060 Ti writes in, and he says, ever since Nvidia got rid of the Max-Q labels, the laptop segment has gotten pretty chaotic. A 140-watt 3070 can beat a 100-watt 3080. A 90-watt 1660 Ti can match a 65-watt 3060. Retailers won't even state a laptop's TDP when it's such a valuable piece of information. Why would Nvidia spiral us into this dreaded state of confusion? Why get rid of the Max-Q moniker when it was actually pretty helpful to the community?
Oh, I think this answer comes down to money, doesn't it? I mean, you can sell a 3080 laptop for more than you can sell a 3070 laptop. So the absolute minimum that you want to tell people is going to help that situation. Like if laptop makers can get away with making a terrible cooling solution that is extremely cheap to produce, yet they can put the RTX 3080 name on it and sell it for maximum money, that benefits everyone in the ecosystem. Nvidia gets the most money from selling their 3080 to the laptop maker, and the laptop maker benefits from being able to sell that laptop for the most money, even if it doesn't perform as good as a well-designed product with a lower tier GPU. So that's why they got, well, I shouldn't say that's why as a definitive, because I don't know for sure. I'm not at Nvidia. I don't know exactly what their thinking was, but clearly there are benefits to doing the system that they've currently got. And the benefits are the laptop makers have a far greater scope to upsell customers without having to bother making the products good. And that's just the OEM market for you. Like, it's all about, there's been times in the past, even with CPUs and things, where, there's two, you get two Core i7 models, and there's one Core i7 model that's even this Intel sells for the same price theoretically on their website, and they just use the worst model in their laptop because they can just advertise it as Core i7. They don't need to really worry about what the actual specifications are, because no one looks at that. They look at, oh, I'm getting a Core i7. Oh, I'm getting a 3080. Beyond that point, doesn't matter. All the rest of the stuff they can hide, and all of that. So Max-Q, I think they got rid of that simply because in the laptop ecosystem, it became known as the slower version. Like, it wasn't. Nvidia tried to make it the efficient version.
That's
so that
how
people
I
would
saw
say,
it. I thought it was kind of cool.
Yeah, like, there are limits to what you can put into a thin and light laptop. Like, you can't just go putting 140 watt 3070s into a 14-inch chassis. Like, it's just not going to work. But the community saw it as, oh, well, I don't want to buy the slow 3070 or the slow 3080. I want to get the full performance 3080. But then for some laptops, it wasn't actually possible to do that. So, I think when Nvidia realized that Max-Q was sort of being used in that way, they weren't keen on it. So they just killed it for that reason and made it so, yes, it introduces more confusion, but they don't have this situation where buyers are avoiding the slow models. So it's unfortunate. I would prefer if the TDPs were accurately listed for every single laptop, but obviously there's an incentive for these companies not to advertise it. So, yep, consumers get screwed over once again, unfortunately, but yeah, that's just the way these things are.
Yeah, I have an HP laptop. Actually, I think I got it almost 2 years ago now, that has a 6-core i7, and they actually made a big deal about it in the NV15T's advertising, that they were like, we actually put a copper vapor chamber heatsink on here and the highest quality paste we could get, because honestly, guys, that cost us an extra $10, $15. And we found in our testing that if we use this type of cooling, our i7 outperforms the 8-core mobile i9. And they did all this marketing showing it against the Dell XPS, and they're like, look, the Dell 8-core loses in multi-threading scores, and it does. But I wonder how much that actually benefited them to just using cheaper cooling in a more expensive i9 with more cores that weren't really boosting.
Yeah, I mean, if they want to make the most money, then they would do the other option where they, choose the highest tier part, try and sell it for as much money as they possibly can, and make no work to making it actually a good product. So obviously the laptop makers that care are going to do it the other way, where they try and use the cheaper parts and make really competitive, more value-oriented products for people. But I think in the OEM market, obviously it's a different market to enthusiast desktop buyers. People typically do less research. There's even just not as many reviews available for all the different laptops and even all the different laptop configurations, because companies often seed their fastest model, so you don't know how the tier down model or the entry-level tier goes with these products. It just makes it very, very difficult for people to do the comparisons where something like a well-engineered laptop with the lower tier parts that's beating the better advertised hardware, it becomes very difficult to sell those products, because you're kind of trusting people to compare the products and review them and to have that message come out. It just makes it very difficult. People just go into stores and look for the Core i7 logo, and they look for the high number RTX logo and buy whatever is suitable for them. That it becomes very difficult if you're trying to say, hey, our Core i5 beats the competitor's Core i7. Very, very difficult. And I always prefer those products, but unfortunately it's just the way it is for those markets.
I will say, though, if you're a dork like me, it makes laptop shopping just super fun to look at all the little specs and compare them and watch. Notebook Check does thousands of laptop reviews a year, and then I'll look at your stuff and be like, oh, this one actually outperforms that one, so I'm really getting this extra deal. If you like doing that, it kind of makes laptop shopping the most fun, but most people don't like doing that. Switching gears, though, and power usage here, I do want to talk to you about this, because now a lot of things that we kind of loosely talked about before are becoming much more firmed up. Have you seen recent Lovelace rumors? I'm personally sure that Nvidia is trying to prepare cards above 450 watts. And at least as of, I think it was a month ago, I was told they're briefing manufacturers on a 600 watt SKU. So it's becoming less and less abstract that they're going to push power usage this much. It's less of a hypothetical. How do you feel about there being 600 watt graphics cards possibly at the end of this year? Certainly 450 watts or higher. And just where do you feel about that too when it comes to all right, so that allows them to double performance. What does that change your calculus if AMD is something that's 450 or 400 watts versus 600 watts, but loses in ray tracing a little, but wins in raster? How do you feel about these insanely high power usage cards, and how's that going to factor in with all the other features?
Okay, yeah, lots to break down here. So let's work through some of these things. I think when it comes to power consumption, honestly, the high-end cards, I've always found that doesn't really matter that much. I know people are going to complain about there being the 600 watt GPU or whatever, but we're talking about Halo products that are going to cost thousands of dollars, and they're going to be bought by rich people. So 3090s are not high volume products. Most people are buying 3060 or below tier cards, and that's really where the power consumption stuff matters more. So yeah, okay, they're making a 600 watt card. It's going to be very difficult to cool. You're going to need a massive power supply. You're going to need air conditioning in your room to run that GPU. Mm-hmm. Okay, whatever. Rich people can deal with all those problems. That's fine. You're already probably going to be paying thousands of dollars for that GPU. Okay, whatever. The problem is if they're making, the next 3060 type GPU, and it's also extremely power hungry. What we really just need to be looking at is sort of what's the efficiency like for these products? Are we actually getting better performance per watt in sort of the normal mid-range mainstream market that people are buying cards for? Or is now the 3060 a 300 watt GPU that's not that much faster than what we had previously? That would be bad. But if, they're taking a 150 watt GPU and increasing it to 200 watts, but we're getting double the performance, I think a lot of people would be perfectly happy with that situation. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I guess it's all about just sort of the general efficiency of the cards rather than what the flagship Halo products are doing. I think people previously have used, back in the SLI Crossfire days, maybe we didn't necessarily get 600 watts, but certainly putting two 250 watt GPUs together was, people were doing that regularly. And the scaling wasn't great. Like, you add in a second card, you add in that 250 watts, and in some games it would offer you like barely any extra performance. So I think going with the much larger GPUs, hitting 450 to 600 watts is a better solution than SLI was back when that was more of a feature. So from my perspective, yeah, I think I expect people to complain about these 600 watt cards and all that, but when we're talking Halo products, I just don't think it matters that much, and it potentially is a better solution than what we had like a decade ago with those dual GPU solutions. And yeah, it just matters about the mid-range. What were the other things? The performance boost and stuff?
Well, yeah, and I mean, like, just to because I agree. When I heard 600 watts, I was like, okay. I mean, I guess I probably wasn't going to get a 4090 anyways. But then you go, well, then what does the 4080 become? 400? 450? Because I still think that's an issue for most people. And I think at a minimum, that means the 4070 will be a 300 watt card. So does it matter if the 4070 is a 300 watt card and the 7700 XT is like a 250 watt card? I don't know. I guess you might say maybe not. But I'm kind of curious if you think there is an inflection point where you go, yeah, this is it 50% more? I mean, and it matters less and less the lower you go down, right? The difference between 100 to 150 is not the difference between 400 to 600. But like, where do you think that inflection point kind of is in the mid range, where you would definitely start panning cards in reviews?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's one factor, obviously. Like, if we're comparing, next gen GPUs, and one brand has a significantly lower power consumption for a similar level of performance, then they're the more efficient card. And again, it's efficiency that matters. If one brand has the more efficient product, then depending on how efficient we're talking, that's going to be a factor for people. And I think for, there's not just the number, that people are worried about. It's about, does it mean for a mid-range card that you have to buy a more powerful power supply, which costs more money? Does it mean your power bills are going to be higher, which for people in Europe at the moment is, a factor that's becoming more and more relevant? Obviously, heat is another issue for people with those products. So yeah, if you had two different vendors that were drastically different in terms of efficiency, then that would definitely be a factor for people. And in your examples of being like 250 watts versus 400 watts, yeah, that's a significant difference that would definitely be relevant for reviews. But then it's just one of many different features. So we'd have to be talking about two cards that are very similar in performance and features for the power consumption to be sort of one of the talking points. But then again, it depends how much more efficient you're talking about one product versus the other. So it's it's really hard to say. It's always a relevant feature, but I think back in the day where cards from AMD, things like the RX 580 were significantly less efficient than the latest and greatest GPUs, but they were cheap, they were powerful, they ran the current games well. People were able to overlook that as a sort of one of the weaknesses. So it really just depends on what the product is like. But with these cards, yeah, I do think that there's potentially going to be some shifting up of the power per tier. But if they're also shifting up pricing, it doesn't really, the name doesn't really matter too much. Like if the 4070 is now going to be from whatever it is now, let's say it's an extra 100 watts, but also costs, it's no longer the $500 card, it's now the $700 or $800 card. Well, it's effectively just the 3080 replacement, and then it's the power consumption difference becomes less. So there's all sorts of considerations with these things. Obviously for reviews, yeah, it's going to be important to some degree. But, it depends on all sorts of different things. Depends, we've seen the creep of product naming over time as being something that really needs to be counted in, well, at least explained in reviews, that, yes, when you bought your GTX 1060 and you bought that for whatever it was, $250, and now those cards are, well, on the current market, they're selling for like $500, right?
Yeah.
The name doesn't really matter that much. It's all about just the price to performance ratio that you're getting in that specific class. Like if you have $500 to spend, is the product actually better than whatever the previous $500 card was? And then, yeah, for efficiency, is the card more efficient, or is one vendor going crazy with power consumption, the other vendor is much more efficient, then potentially for some people the efficient card would be the way to go. But yeah, that's how I sort of always approach these comparisons, not worrying too much about whatever people are buying for $2,000 and whatever the maximum spec is, just doing that sort of gen-to-gen comparison at the same price and figuring out, are we actually moving in a good direction or are we moving in a bad direction? And hopefully this generation we, across the board, get better price to performance and get better efficiency.
Well, it's officially spring, which for me and my dog Reese means getting outside and growing some fresh food in our garden. And also, it means having to mow the lawn every week, having to take care of weeds, and just having to maintain the yard in general, which means that, yeah, during the spring and summer months, I like having a quick snack that I can make so I waste as little time as possible now that I'm spending more time taking care of my yard. But I also, of course, want it to be healthy and tasty, and, well, yeah, that's where Vite Ramen comes in. Vite Ramen is an American company that, just like me, likes using fresh ingredients to make meals tasty and healthy. And it only takes a few minutes to make, and they keep updating their recipe, like the V3 edition of beef pho recently, to keep ensuring their product is as good as it can be. So make sure, even if you bought them before, you check back at their store. And if you do, click on the link in the description and use the offer code BrokenSilicon to save 10% on a special bundle just for Moore's Law Z fans. That gives you $25 in free goodies, and it really does help support this channel tremendously. Seriously, I eat Vite Ramen. It's tasty, it's healthy, it's fresh, and it's especially reasonably priced if you use the Moore's Law Z deal. Try Vite Ramen today. So, on a different feature note then, Illyrium writes in, he says, thrilled to have you back, Tim. Where is the honest cutoff point to mention Nvidia as a worthy purchase due to its ray tracing performance advantage alone? I can't help but feel that those below a 3070 wouldn't want to hit that big of a hit to performance by using ray tracing when playing a game like Control. Yet we keep having reviewers mentioning ray tracing on lower tiered cards. Any word to the wise on this and to prevent people from having false expectations and how important this is at different tiers?
Well, you can ray trace on an APU these days. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's multiple ways to look at ray tracing as a feature addition. I've always seen it be making the most sense for people that are already playing on maximum or ultra settings, right? Because it has ray tracing typically, maybe not always the case, but it's one of the worst features for the sort of, I don't know what you'd call it, like the quality to performance ratio. Like the quality uplift versus the performance hit that you get tends to be not very favorable for ray tracing. Like if you were trying to optimize your settings, typically you would turn off ray tracing as one of the first settings or enable it the last because the hit is so great compared to the quality uplift, right? So for me, I've always thought of ray tracing is you're already playing on ultra settings, you've maxed everything out, the game looks great, and you want that sort of next level in terms of, you know, performance, the next level in terms of quality. So you turn on ray tracing, right? So I think we sort of need to look at the cutoff as being that card, that sort of level of GPU that you can run ultra settings and then run ray tracing. If you're running on like a 3050, you know, those GPUs, you can't run ultra settings and ray tracing at the same time. So it's like how relevant is the ray tracing performance on those products? Like we're sort of talking about running medium settings plus ray tracing. Does that make a lot of sense? And even cards with, you know, 8 gigabytes of VRAM or less tend to be, you know, they tend to struggle with the ultra quality settings and ray tracing combination because ray tracing tends to increase VRAM usage. So, you know, with these situations, yeah, I tend to think that the cards that can do ultra settings and ray tracing at the same time are sort of the time that it makes sense to buy for ray tracing, which I think these days is probably sort of around that 3070 cutoff or above. Ideally, like 3080 type product makes the most sense. But for something like a 3050, it's like, do you even care about the ray tracing performance on that card? Like,
I do in Metro Exodus
it's not that fast.
Edition, though. I will say that there were a couple games that surprised me, though, like Metro Exodus, where I was like, oh, wow, with DLSS, I can actually run this like high settings with ray tracing in 4K. I was like, what? Like, and that's just something a 6500 XT isn't doing. I tried.
Yeah.
It's just one game, though, I suppose. So, I mean, I guess to make it a more specific question, though, when it comes to RDNA 3, I'm not 100% sure, of course, but I'm expecting it to take the pure raster crown by a little bit over Lovelace, but I also kind of expect Lovelace to have a slight win in ray tracing at least. I'm not, like, what do you think about a lineup where one company say, again, yeah, who cares about the 600 watt card? But across the board, let's say typically uses 20% more energy, loses in raster performance by 10%, wins in ray tracing by 10%, and it has DLSS versus FSR 2.0. Like, do you think at that point AMD can fairly price their competitors at the same price? Or do you still think because of like DLSS that they need to charge a little less? And do you think that ray tracing is to this point where, yeah, look, if one wins in ray tracing by 10%, one wins in raster by 10%, it's a trade-off. Do you see it as a trade-off, or how heavily do you favor that ray tracing win?
We're getting into a very difficult conversation now because we're talking about...
But we're two super dorks with YouTube channels, so this is the type of conversation only we can have.
Yeah, so we're talking hypotheticals for future generations. I mean, there's so many... Yeah, I know you've mentioned here just things like rasterization performance, ray tracing performance, power consumption, maybe DLSS features, there's other things as well, like your encoding performance and things. But I think, AMD is in a position where their market share is not very good for GPUs, right? Like, they're getting pretty much destroyed by Nvidia, even when their performance is competitive-ish in some areas with something like this current generation, right? So I think even if they were better at everything, they still need to make their cards cheaper. Like, that's just, if they want to actually start producing, they start making cards that are, people are buying them, they want people to buy them, then they need to be better and cheaper. I think they were sort of, with this generation, maybe a bit too early on thinking that they were competitive and thinking that, they can price their cards at the level of Nvidia, because people are still just going to buy it even if it has an Nvidia sticker on the box.
And now that there's availability, that's obvious. They're staying in stock at MSRP, Nvidia isn't.
So yeah, I think even if they had wins in everything, they still have to be cheaper. Well, of course, I don't expect that to happen. There are going to be things like what you're suggesting, where maybe they're faster in some areas and slower in some areas. Maybe they have good features in some areas and they don't in some other areas. Yeah, it becomes that point where you have to just assess every single element of the GPU in all the different areas to see what sort of level we're getting to in terms of how competitive are AMD. And even then, that just depends how much cheaper they have to be. At least that's my opinion. I think AMD investors probably would have a different opinion, and they'd want to be selling their better products at the highest possible prices that they can. But, if they're only selling like 20 to 25% of the GPUs on the market, I think they kind of have to start, increasing their mind share, increasing their market share to have, if they can continue executing on hardware, at least be more competitive down the track. They can't just keep conceding these markets to Nvidia over and over again and sort of, trying to think that they're as competitive as Nvidia when they perhaps aren't quite at that level yet. I think we saw something similar with like the Zen series. Like Zen 2 was pretty good. Like, performance was very competitive with Intel at the time. Obviously didn't win in everything, but it got pretty close. And those products were often very, very affordable, which then allowed future generations to start moving the price further and further up as they kept getting more and more market share. Zen 3 was able to launch at prices that were, much closer to what Intel used to charge, and they were still getting the sales. Whereas I don't think they'll be able to do that with their GPUs just yet. I don't think they're in that position.
No, I agree. I think they put the cart before the horse with RDNA too, that they got away with it because everything was out of stock. But it's obvious now that they would not have gotten away with charging the same price as Nvidia if things weren't out of stock. It's funny, I was talking to one of my contributors today about Navi 33, and at this point I think I am pretty much ready to just unveil the entire specs. I mean, this is, without saying everything, I think it is a sub 400 millimeter squared card, still on 6 nanometer, Navi 21 performance, lower power usage. It's really cool they're using a last gen node for an RDNA 3 product, and I think it's it's going to have less RAM. I think it could totally make good profit margins at $400 and bring something around a 6900 XT, at least in 1080p, to the mid-range. But I know they're considering charging $500 for it, and I'm just like, I am convinced, no, AMD. This can be your new RX 480. It has to be 400. You cannot charge 500. You have a chance using a last-gen node to pump out a ton of cards. Just do it and don't get ahead of yourself here, because no one's going to... I'm really pretty confident no one's going to want it at 500 compared to 400.
Yeah, and I think the market will tell them that pretty quickly. Like if they produce a $500 card that no one wants, then they're quickly going to be able to realize the mistake that they've made. I think this generation, I really hope that companies don't take the wrong messages out of what's happened with this generation, because I don't think we'll see the same conditions that we've seen for this generation for the next generation.
Me neither.
In terms of thing, obviously, I still expect cards to be very, very difficult to find for many months after launch, but I don't expect there to be the same pressures for demand, and hopefully the supply shortages continue to improve and mining continues to be less of a relevant factor. So, if AMD is looking at their data and they're seeing, we made all the cards we made were sold at all the prices we said this generation, so that therefore we can do that the same next generation and price our cards just like Nvidia's cards and get away with it. If that's their takeaway from this generation, I think they'll be in with a bit of a shock, because I think it was mostly just people buying whatever was available. Mm-hmm. Like, I can't buy a 3080. Well, let's see if the 6800 XT is available. I can buy a 6600 XT. I can't buy anything from Nvidia. I think that played a lot into this generation. And if they get ahead of themselves and they start trying to be super competitive on pricing, then their cards will just sit on shelves. That, if availability is better this generation, they just will sit on shelves. They'll have to lower prices and sort of, whatever you want to say for that situation. But so let's hope that doesn't happen. I hope they do continue to create, the value option, at least for this next generation, where I think they need to start winning people over to realize that, AMD GPUs can actually be a good option.
It looked like you held your tongue there. You are allowed to swear on this show. I mean, I'm not going to encourage you to, but you are certainly allowed to. But yeah, I mean, I really am confident as well that we're not going to... I think people forget, it's usually hard to get graphics cards after they come out. I mean, you couldn't get a 1080 for MSRP for the entire holiday season. It hit $800 average street price, and that's what's normal. And I think that's what we're going to see here. And, it's funny. I know recently, as of this recording day, like, there's rumors, Lovelace is launching sooner than people might expect. But I think the rumor's always been Q3 or even early Q3. At least in my Lovelace leak, I said production of Ampere may even stop in May. And I'm finding that more and more easy to believe, because when I asked some distributors today, like, what do you think about Lovelace, launching in, like, not in 2 months, but in like 1 month and a half or something, they're like, well, I think there's very little chance of that when we have entire storerooms full of unsold Ampere cards that we are really worried we're going to have to lower down to MSRP. And this isn't the same situation as before the launch of last gen. I really think people are underestimating, even if the price is at a certain level on Newegg, how much of that is a game of chicken between these sellers right now, that they're really, really worried Nvidia is going to announce Lovelace before they can sell these cards, frankly, for what they paid for them to even stock them. So I really... And then we're going to see the flood of used 3070s for like $300 on eBay or something.
Oh, yeah, can't say I'm too upset at that situation.
No.
I mean, distributors have been price gouging customers for this generation, so who really cares about whether they can sell their cards or not? That's just the way it is, I guess. But, yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree. I don't think this generation is going to have the same conditions at all. So, yeah, but obviously cards are still going to be hard to come by.
Someone's going to send you the soundbite and be like, I couldn't get it on launch day. You lied to me.
Well, no, you're not going to be able to get it on launch day. And even if you could, pricing is probably not going to be at MSRP for quite some time. Nvidia has been testing the waters with a few unrealistic MSRPs, starting as far back as the 2080 Ti with, it's $1,000 and then most cards sell for $1,200. So, I expect that to continue, but I certainly wouldn't be thinking that 6 months to a year from the launch that you still can't get those products. And especially if they do launch at a higher price. So yeah, even if they, there's a Q3 launch of whenever it's going to be, I don't know. I don't know if any of the leaks are accurate or whatever, but even if, July is an accurate month that they announce the products, when's the month where you can actually just go buy one? Like that's
actually launching in July. Where's the leak of a cooler, right? I mean, I think it's definitely like, paper launch if it's July. I mean, come on.
Yeah, like, are we getting cards on store shelves in like early August, but they're producing like 100 of them? Because that's not really a launch. Like, yeah, I know it's technically a launch, but what matters to me is like, when can you buy these cards? When is it easy to buy them? And then second to that, when is it easy to buy them at the price that they said it would be? And those two dates, I mean, I think the distributors probably still have a few more months until we reach those sorts of times. At the very least, towards the end of the year, I wouldn't be too surprised if those situations don't happen until sort of the end of the year.
Well, so speaking of hard to get products, I'm going to skip ahead to this here. QH Freddy writes, and he says, guys, why do you think AMD has been so slow to push Rembrandt U laptops? Do you have any in the pipeline for reviews? And I did look around, and just in general, I have to agree with what a lot of people submitting questions for this episode have said, which is that I haven't paid attention because I'm not in the market for a laptop right now, but it is hard to find a Rembrandt laptop anywhere. Like, really hard,
it's hard to find a lot of laptops. Even, a lot of companies are still even launching their Alder Lake, like low power Alder Lake stuff in many months from now. So I think there does appear to be some supply and manufacturing issues at the moment. I'm pretty confident that we should have, at least what I was told many months ago, is we should have seen Rembrandt U laptops by now. Like they should have actually been on the market by now. I don't think AMD was intentionally announcing them ages ago and then waiting until whatever I don't know what the current rumors are saying for when they're going to be available, but let's just say next month or something. I don't think they were expecting that to happen. I should be getting a 6000 U series laptop shortly for testing. I don't know whether that's going to be like next week or next month or whenever, but within the next couple of weeks, I think is when we'll start seeing the performance numbers for the 6000 U series stuff. Like hopefully that's the 6800U. But as for on store shelves, that's a totally different question. I've got no idea for that. So yeah, I think there has been a few manufacturing issues for these sorts of products. This laptop generation has felt very slow to get a lot of the products that we'd normally expect out, even for Intel. And Intel usually for their, they've had less supply constraints for their own stuff manufactured on their own nodes. So yeah, I don't think it's like AMD trying to push silicon to weird other products that they're trying to sell. I think it's just there's all sorts of issues at the moment with the ongoing effects of COVID, and manufacturing in China and stuff like that has been very complicated. Even for things like monitors, things have been getting delayed, and low volumes for products that have come out onto the market early. So yeah, I expect that to continue to be an issue throughout most of this year. So hopefully if people are interested in those laptops, there will be something to buy in the next couple of months. But yeah, it doesn't seem like the market definitely doesn't seem like it was a couple of years ago, where you'd see like the back to school launch and suddenly there's like 500 different laptops all immediately available with the latest and greatest hardware. Yeah, that really hasn't happened this time, which I guess is a bit of a disappointment, but that's just the way that the shortages are these days.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much I really have to say about Rembrandt. I was kind of expected to talk about it a decent with you. We've been going for a while, and I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts since our last discussion. I know we discussed it after they announced it, but it's like, it's good, right? More efficient than Intel. I don't know if you have any thoughts on it since it's out that have changed since when it was first announced.
Yeah, not really. I mean, I haven't actually been able to do that much testing, to be honest. I think from the 6000 series, I've only looked at the HS series part, which was sort of around Alder Lake at that. The scaling was obviously indicating that it would be more efficient at lower TDPs than what I tested, but around that sort of 35, 45 watts, it was fairly similar to Alder Lake, and then Alder Lake was obviously faster for the higher power consumption levels. So yeah, I don't think anything there's changed too much. Again, it's really about being unable to get products into test for these generations. Like even getting in P series and U series parts from Intel has been challenged. So yeah, hopefully we'll be able to compare those two parts in depth and sort of see exactly where the U series sits for these two companies. But it certainly seems to be the case that AMD's got the advantage in the lower tiers and lower power tiers, I should say, and Intel in the higher power tiers. But again, it's hard to make that conclusion when I haven't actually confirmed the sort of trends that we saw with the other parts just yet. So hopefully we'll be able to do that soon with the at least the P series versus U series type comparisons.
Yeah, it almost feels like by the time Rembrandt's highly available, we're going to be talking about Zen 4 APU launches.
Yeah, probably.
I mean, let me then skip just ahead to that then. Last time we spoke, AMD demoed a Zen 4 chip running all-core boost in Halo above 5 gigahertz, which of course, Zen 3 typically only boosts all cores between 4.3 to 4.7 most of the time. So I think right there was proof just right away that they're going to bring at least 10% higher boost clocks with Zen 4. And now have engineering samples leaking with boosting about 5.2 gigahertz. And I've leaked that I'm confident boost clocks are going to be 8 to 15% higher with 15 to 25% higher IPC. So I think we're getting at least 30%, not 30% higher single threading at a minimum with boost all core boosting, allowing for even maybe higher than that in multi-threading. I wonder if you have any thoughts on like another generation late this year bringing 30 to 40% performance increases over Zen 3 again. And I think we're going to get at least that next year as well. Like, what are you excited about most when it comes to Zen 4? And then also I'm just kind of starting to wonder, like, when we start talking about how much we care about performance increases, when we're already, the overwhelming majority of CPUs are just blowing games out of the water.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the performance uplifts that we're talking about here, it's kind of, it sounds really high, right? Like you're talking 30 to 40% gains, but then you think about how long ago was Zen 3 when Zen 4 comes out? It's probably going to be roughly 2 years-ish, maybe a little less. I don't know exactly when it's coming out, but 2 years roughly. And we've also had Alder Lake, which obviously for single thread performance is currently faster than Zen 3. Yeah, especially in productivity workloads. I know, if you count the X3D for games, we get into sort of a complicated battle, but for most productivity workloads, Alder Lake is quite a bit faster in terms of single thread performance. So when you think about like, we're getting 30 to 40% more performance than the previous generation Zen product, well, they kind of need that because if they're like 15 to 20% behind Intel, then you're going to need that minimum to match them. And then it would be kind of a bit of a fail to just match Intel with a product a year later. So you'd want then to get like another 10, 15, 20% on top of that, which is then where you sort of see the 30 to 40% figures sounding like, well, that's pretty much what AMD needs to do, really. Especially if they're competing up against a next generation Intel part as well, because
Raptor
if they're
Lake,
just if they're just coming and matching Alder Lake and then Raptor Lake launches is much faster, what was the point? Like, they just look silly. Like, their performance targets have to be significantly higher than the current Intel part from it's not quite a year ago now, but almost a year ago. And then on top of that, that's going to be extra percentage compared to Zen 3. So, yeah, I mean, I would hope that those are the sort of performance gains that we are getting. And current CPU competition is red hot. So if we see that each year, then that's good. But, I guess those are the performance targets that each of these companies need to have. As for whether it's actually important to get like 30% more performance than current CPUs, I mean, obviously for productivity workloads, that's going to be great because they're always limited. So the faster you can run these things like video editing or all the simulations, whatever, that's going to be great. For gaming, it really depends on the gamer, because if you are playing competitive games and you're trying to get the highest frame rates in these titles, then you are going to be CPU limited today. So faster CPU is going to give you more performance. That's going to be a big boon. But obviously for a lot of single player titles, the more, those sorts of games, it doesn't really matter that much. and we'll need to see significant improvements to gaming, just the general games themselves in terms of how they utilize the CPU. But then again, we're about to come into this generation of GPUs where supposedly the GPUs are going to be twice as fast. Well, if you have a GPU that's twice as fast, you're much more likely to be CPU bottlenecked. And if you're already CPU bottlenecked and you're suddenly buying a GPU that's twice as fast and you're not getting twice the CPU performance, you're going to run into an issue. So, I think it's always, it's hard to sit here and say, yeah, it's not going to matter because, it may matter in some games. We may start seeing crazy Unreal Engine 5 games that just smash the CPU to smithereens, especially if game developers start going back and targeting 30 FPS on consoles. And we're sitting here as PC gamers being like, that's trash tier. I want to play, 120 FPS or higher. Then maybe we will need that CPU performance. So I don't think it's going to hurt at the very least.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think 30 hertz is dead. I think it's just done.
Well, I hope so.
I mean, it should be, that's for sure. But I'm starting to think about like a recent guest I had on Hardware Numbers who does some pretty extreme CPU overclocking and then tests games. He was talking about how like an Alder Lake i3 is as strong as an 8700K. And it's just hilarious to think that it wasn't that long ago that we were debating if an 8700K was worth it, over like a 3700X or something. And now we have i3s at that level that are $100. What happens when we have a generation, let's say 40% better than this year, and then 40% better than that next year? What happens when we have like i3s that are as strong as a 5800X 3D? I just wonder if at a certain point for gamers we start going, can it do something else? Like, do you think that's going to be an inflection point soon, or do you think developers really are just going to make use of it that quickly?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know for sure. I think, the games are always going to be held back by the lowest common denominator, which is the consoles, right? So the Zen 2 CPU, it looked good when, it looked good when those consoles came out because the previous CPU was just absolutely atrocious. But, it's very quickly going to be the case where the Zen 2 cores in those consoles are not going to be that powerful. But I think we're also in this kind of transition period where a lot of games coming out today are still built on fairly old game engines, and game engines that were developed for an era where CPU performance wasn't improving that much each generation. So if you think about when, like Unreal Engine 4 was being developed, that development process was going on during the Skylake era, where the developers were saying, we're sort of sitting on this sort of level of cores, and Intel is sort of producing 5%, 10% gains per year. We don't really need to make a game engine that's going to heavily utilize CPU effects because we're not expecting to get major performance uplifts. And now we're in this ecosystem where it's very different. Like, performance uplifts are very significant in terms of CPUs. So, and you can see from some of the things that Unreal Engine 5 games can do that there are elements to those engines that appear to be very CPU demanding. So I think over time, as we see games transition from last-gen game engines that were developed primarily for the last generation of consoles for very weak CPUs and no CPU advancement, we move to engines where game developers are starting to, think about next generation, think about developing properly for these current generation of consoles, thinking about developing properly for an ecosystem where there's 16 core CPUs and 30% gains every couple of years. I think we'll start to see developers utilize those CPU resources better. But again, lots of games are built on very old game engines, and there's just no point radically patching those engines to use these new CPU resources. It's going to take complete overhauls of those engines being built for the ground up for modern technology for things like direct storage. Like, really utilizing that sort of technology requires big engine overhauls. So I think there is going to be a period of time, maybe a couple of years, where these CPUs are massively overpowered for today's games, and it won't make a lot of sense to buy high end or even mid range, Zen 4 chips, because they just destroy current games. But then hopefully once new engines start coming out and developers start realizing that, we can have games that have like thousands upon thousands of NPCs at once, that we'll start seeing situations like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I think about how I think 60 hertz is going to be the standard, and so then basically you're saying, I don't know, 3700 is basically the standard for kind of 60 hertz gaming without a ton of things turned up. At the same time, though, the wild card really is asset streaming. And like, if we do see some of the fabled PS5 features actually come into effect, like, do we need those extra cores to move in data quickly from an SSD? I do suspect what we're going to hit soon is kind of an awkward period, almost like what happened late, like PS360 through PS4 transition, where there were like some games that had like 1 gigabyte VRAM requirements, and then you had other games that were like, you need 6 threads and you also need 8 gigabytes or it won't even like boot or something. Like, I think we're going to see some games that, like you say, like, just, I mean, I'm playing the new Borderlands. The thing still just makes you load individual areas. And then you're going to see other games where I wouldn't be surprised if, like, if not, I know Zen 4 Genoa has some sort of like SSD controller thing, but like, at very least Zen 5 Consumer and Meteor Lake have some kind of IP block on there for moving data from the SSD quickly. You have these weird Meteor Lake i3s that in some games outperform last gen flagships, but then other games where you still need really fast clock speeds. I think we're going to get another one of those periods where everyone's blaming bad PC ports, and it's going to be odd.
Yeah. I mean, if people want to see more effects, like more NPCs, more AI, more simulation-based effects, then you're not going to be able to run those games at 120 FPS, 240 FPS. And then, yes, people will probably complain about the optimization and, say it's a bad port and that. But, I think when we get more into the ray tracing era of games, when games start shipping with genuinely good ray tracing effects, which there's probably a handful of games, a small percentage of the total number of ray tracing games today where that's true. Hopefully in the next couple of years there's many more games where ray tracing makes a significant improvement. And I think as we move into more and more games utilizing ray tracing better, it's going to be clear that those games are not going to be able to use those ray tracing effects on consoles. So if developers want to really go down the ray tracing path and make games that significantly utilize it, they're going to have to be developed primarily with the PC in mind, and then obviously turning down lots of stuff for consoles, which again, it's very possible with the architectures being the same. So I think hopefully we see similar things with the CPU as well, in that game developers are thinking of making games that are highly scalable. Like previously we've seen lots of games where they just, you get the console experience, and then it's either on PC you can run it at a much higher resolution and frame rate, or you can turn up a few things slightly that are sort of tank your performance a lot but don't really improve your visuals all that much. At least I hope, I don't know whether this is actually going to happen, I hope the next gen of games, the next coming years of games, is far more scalable, where we see genuinely massive quality, like the quality of the game improving when we're on a PC that's got significantly more resources available to it, where we see, the standard game for consoles is like mostly rasterization with like maybe one ray tracing effect enabled, maybe like a limited number of NPCs, limited simulations and stuff. Then you bring it over to PC and you see, suddenly the ray tracing effects, the majority of the lighting instead of just a small part of the lighting is ray traced. You start seeing, those open world city type games where it really feels like there's an realistic level of cars and people, which you just can't do on CPUs the level of what's in the consoles. And then you see simulations and all those sorts of things as well. So I hope that happens, but again, PC gaming has to be in a strong position for developers to warrant making those sorts of investments into producing those sorts of effects and stuff. But I think with engines like Unreal Engine 5, it should be a bit easier for developers to make scalable games that can run on really low-end hardware, hopefully even things like the Steam Deck, and then scale well up into realistic looking settings and simulations for PC, hopefully.
Yeah, I think when like just thinking ahead here, like what game would do that? Because certainly, if anything, people have seen PC gaming is really popular right now. So I think
Yeah.
there is an argument for trying that again. But I think like a GTA 6 is a game that comes to mind that maybe has the budget and the reason to try for that. Or maybe a Metro game or something like that. Because the only thing I would have to point out is I don't know what's going on with Battlefield long term. And a lot of other like of the biggest mainstream shooters, I sent a screenshot of an email I got from Activision to my brother today, laughing like what, and I captioned, "What the hell is happening to multiplayer shooters?" And it just said Godzilla's in Warzone, and I'm like, what is happening to my multiplayer games? You're just like vomiting like Saints Row DLC into every game I play. Like, what is going on? And so that's the only thing I would say is a lot of the most popular games that could benefit from really pushing PC have kind of turned into these freemium models. So I think GTA 6 is probably a game that would do that. But outside of that, it's almost double A single player games, which would be the ones who would probably push the envelope the most.
Yeah, I mean, with multiplayer games, I think developers have realized that you want to target as many people as you possibly can, which means you sort of have to look at the lowest common denominator, which for a lot of people is still like a very old CPU running a GTX 1060 type GPU, or even integrated graphics if you can scale your game down that far. So, yeah, I think a lot of multiplayer games will still head down that sort of route and sort of try and make the games run on potatoes, basically. But hopefully, there are some games where we see more advanced features take hold, especially if there was something that was designed for current gen consoles in mind that wasn't built on older engines, that was built for something like a PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X exclusive multiplayer game. Potentially you would see more PC type features come across and have a more graphically impressive experience there. But as well, we've seen a lot of people over the last couple of years upgrade their CPUs to things that are genuinely much more powerful, moving to the some sort of Zen processor. There's lots of people using AM4 hardware, right? So a lot of those people are going to have quite reasonable CPUs, and hopefully that will shift the lowest common denominator from like a 7700K type quad core thingo to something that's much more powerful. And then hopefully, those even games that are trying to go for the freemium model or the target every single gamer we can model, they don't have to target a quad core or dual core anymore. They can target a sort of a console level, quad core, 8 core, Zen 2 processor or something like that. I think that would work. That would work well. And then again, for PC, you could have game modes where there's many more people in the games, like battle royales where there's not 100 players but there's 500 players or whatever. Those options would be opened up with faster PCs if they wanted to go down that path. I think with the latest Battlefield, I know that was a massive fail, but they did increase the player count, didn't they? Which caused a few performance issues.
I did find that, on my laptop with that 6-core i7, it is better to play at 64 players than on my 3950X, which just has no trouble running 128 players.
Yeah, so there's always options like that for PC, but yeah, I think it's really the big budget single player games where we'd see benefits like that. But again, it really depends on the engine, because hopefully, game engines of the future will have more automated tools to easily increase, geometry density or NPC density, card density, where, you don't have to have a developer going and hand tuning, the difference between 100 NPCs and 1,000 NPCs. They just click a button and suddenly the game is running with 1,000 NPCs instead of 100. That would make that scaling process for PC much easier.
All right, so we've been talking for quite a while here, so I'm actually just going to skip ahead here to this final question that I think would be a fun one to end it on. Chris Rich writes in, and he says, for the three main companies in this space, being Intel, AMD, and Nvidia, how have your impressions of them changed in the recent years? What would you say are their greatest achievements and failures in recent years? What would you say their biggest strengths and weaknesses currently are?
Wow, big question. um, yeah, I think my impression of AMD has probably changed the most, as it has for most people. In that, AMD used to be, especially on CPU side, obviously not very competitive and kind of a bit of a joke. And they've managed to completely turn their company around. Like, I don't think if we were sitting here in 2014, we'd be thinking, oh, AMD is going to turn their company around massively and become a major competitor in many different areas. So I think that's sort of been one of the major things where my impressions have changed of the company. But I think it's almost changing again a little bit now, where they've gone from the we need to accelerate our company to being competitive and produce really good value budget parts to sort of being more on the, we're in the kind of in the dominant position in some areas for things like CPUs. So we can, start to roll back some of the value options that we were offering and start targeting, super high margin, expensive, parts. So I guess that's kind of how I see AMD at the moment. Nvidia, they're just the same company. They're just I've operated just like military efficiency, doing the exact same thing every single time. There's really been no surprises for them. I think Intel, sort of kind of the opposite of AMD. I was a bit surprised at how far back they'd sort of fallen maybe over the last 5 years or so. But at the same time, a lot of their parts are still very competitive despite all the challenges that they've had. So I think, one of the, if we talk about their biggest strengths and greatest achievements, I think one of Intel's greatest achievements has been, when they've been hamstrung by their process technology, that they've still managed to have parts that aren't like significantly slower than their competition on much more advanced process nodes. Like, people always laugh at the power consumption of like 14 and all the 14 nanometer plus stuff. But the fact that those parts were actually competitive with like 7 nanometer parts in terms of performance is pretty impressive in my opinion. I think that's a bit of an achievement for them. And then, where do we go for like Nvidia's achievements? They just seem to execute well on most of their things that they're targeting, and they put a lot of effort into features and even if the features don't make sense when they're launched, like ray tracing or DLSS, they don't. They always seem to be at the forefront of those sorts of things and give people sort of the tech demos of the future. Hopefully, they don't do another Turing where they make people pay to access the tech demo significantly. But at least they do. They clearly put a lot of research and development into those areas, which I think does benefit the ecosystem as a whole. So, that's kind of where I see them at the moment. All those three different companies. Bit of a juicy question to finish this one off.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I wrote down like my thoughts ahead of time, and they're pretty similar to what you said. I'd say with Nvidia, I just think it's their consistency is what's impressed me. That they even Turing, which people lambast, but it's like, where was AMD when Turing launched? They had no competition, and on effectively the same node, they managed to bring a full new generation of performance again. And that's it was a pricing issue. It wasn't a hardware issue with Turing. It was the pricing. Yeah, and I think with Nvidia though, I don't have much negative things to say outside of like just turning into like a AMD fanboy channel where I just call them evil over and over because I don't really think they're evil. I think looking back on it though, I think in a few years, the one thing that maybe we'll dock NVIDIA for is if they don't have chiplet GPUs yet. Because I do see this as possibly finally something where AMD can really start to hit back in a way that is hard for them to keep competitive with. In a similar way to what they did to Intel, except that I don't see NVIDIA becoming inconsistent. I see them still executing on time, even if AMD has some kind of advantage that's took them like a decade to build up. It's too soon to say, though, on that one, if that is good foresight or if, next year they'll be like, hey, Blackwell is 4 chiplets, joke's on you, who knows. But the thing with AMD is I'm happy they've managed to compete at all and they didn't go out of business. Yeah. But their consistency leaves a lot to be desired. And Intel, it's just... they just make so many weird and random mistakes. Their consistency is just all over the place. But the one thing I have to give Intel is i5s are still below $300.
Yeah, I think each company definitely it's not like we can sit here and say there's one company that's like completely shocking and terrible, and the other, another company is like awesome and doing everything right. All of these companies have areas to improve, and all of these companies have had products over the last couple of years that have been impressive in one way or another. I think, going back to some of the Nvidia discussion, I think, chiplets may be an issue for them. I don't know if they're developing that as a hardware technology.
I'm sure they're working on it,
Oh, I'm sure they're working on all sorts of next, very future-looking technologies, because they always are.
Mm-hmm.
I think as well for them, if they start getting genuine competition in the GPU market, more serious competition, they don't just get 80% of the sales of GPUs just straight off the bat every single generation. I think their closed source approach for a lot of their features is going to become more of an issue, because the way that they've been able to, I don't know if get away with is the right term to use, but get away with all their closed source exclusive features is because they're the dominant player, right? Like they had the most GPUs sold, they have the most money to incentivize developers and people to use their features. But if they're not in that position anymore, then continuing to use that approach will look a bit silly, because if other companies continue to do more open approaches, as we always know, the open approaches tend to win out over time, as we saw with sort of like the G-Sync versus FreeSync thing and many other things in the past. But obviously that's a more recent and very relevant example. I think if it comes to more of a 50-50 market share ecosystem, which we could be talking decades away from that sort of being a reality, then producing more closed source things is not going to be the path forward. And I would prefer to see them produce more compatible and open features, because I think the thing that frustrates me with Nvidia is that a lot of the features that they come up with are genuinely very good features. Like they're really excellent. They're forward thinking.
You can get mad at them for how closed off G-Sync was, but where was AMD with variable refresh rate? Thank God they forced the question.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly how I see it, really. AMD, it's kind of like AMD needs to start producing those forward-thinking features. Like they need to, and they're doing it to some degree, but often the features are sort of not as impressive as sort of like a DLSS 2.0 or something like that when they launch. But I think, AMD needs to sort of put in the time and effort to develop those really forward-looking features so that, they come out with a new feature and everyone's like, whoa, that's really impressive. People haven't done that before. We've seen AMD execute on hardware and producing really good performance, but I can't think of a time where I've seen a feature from AMD where I'm like, whoa, that's a look into the future. Even something like SAM, which is sort of their resizable bar type feature. It's not really like we're looking into the future of performance when it gives like a 3 to 5% performance uplift. It's like, okay, that's sort of a neat feature. Okay, other GPU developers will definitely enable that. But where's the sort of we're first to ray tracing from AMD? That's what I want to see from them. And I think for Nvidia, it's kind of the developing their features but making it sort of an open and available for all people to use, which again kind of goes against their commercial interests. So it's asking a lot of them, and they've never, as far as I can remember, done it in the past. So, but that's where I'd like those two companies to go, I guess.
Yeah, it's weird to look at AMD's graphics card tech and almost feel like the console makers are trying more radical new rendering ideas than AMD is.
Yeah, they are.
It's ridiculous. And you wonder why they haven't pushed that. Although, again, my recent Zen 4 leak, it sounds like there is an IP block in Genoa that could theoretically do things similar to how Sony describes the PS5, where they have an accelerator that allows you to move data from an SSD to a graphics card without having to touch the CPU cores. It sounds like that might be there, but then the question is that only in Genoa for professional apps, or are you actually bringing that out in a Phoenix APU and Zen 4? Because AMD's adoption rate here, at least in enthusiast circles, is pretty dang good with Ryzen. They really have CPU mindshare, so now's the time to leverage that sort of an advantage if they're ever going to get around to doing it.
Yeah, I agree. I think they need to, and it helps with mindshare as well. Like, it's not just about producing the features and having forward-looking features. It's about, you want to be perceived as a company that's constantly innovating and producing the best quality stuff, not just in terms of performance, but in terms of, people are going to have access to the latest and greatest thing. And while that doesn't matter for a lot of buyers who are just after price to performance ratio value products, it does help with the perception. I think that's why Nvidia is such a successful brand, is that it's not just that they execute on hardware and performance consistently, but they also are at the forefront of these features. It hasn't just been ray tracing. It's been things like tessellation and HBAO and anti-aliasing and things like that, where they've consistently tended to have those features first, or at least better performance in those features first. So hopefully, if AMD can find some sort of feature like maybe that accelerator that you're talking about, that they can be like, we're at the forefront of, data, IO type stuff. Those are the sort of area. And, Intel with Thunderbolt, another example of, Intel being at the forefront of connectivity. I think AMD needs a few of those features.
Yeah.
But we'll see. Hopefully they've got some stuff.
Well, yeah, but what about Mantle?
Yeah, I mean...
Is that not as important as like G-Sync or DLSS? Come on.
Mantle was a good feature, but they kind of, it wasn't used in that many games. Like, they sort of released it and they're like, go do with this now. Everyone, we don't have any money, so everyone go do what you can with this technology, and let's hope for the best.
Well, yeah, I of course mostly meant that as a joke. I remember them making a big deal about it though for about a year there.
I think you bring it up as a joke, but it also is kind of a good point as well, because Mantle was an innovative, let's get closer to the GPU hardware, and sort of was at the forefront of what became Vulkan. Well, Mantle effectively became Vulkan, and then obviously DX12 as well utilized a lot of the. I think they were in development at the same time, so it's hard to say like DirectX 12 looked at Mantle and was like, let's do that. But it certainly was at the forefront of the closer to the silicon type processing for games for the future. The issue with them was that they just had absolutely no resources to try and make Mantle into a sort of a dominant force. Like, if that was an Nvidia technology, they would have made it extremely exclusive. They would have been pumping it out in games, saying like, we can, we use less overhead so we can get better performance on us, so obviously now they're in a better position to be able to capitalize on stuff like that. Not that I want them to make exclusive features, I definitely don't want them to do that, but that at least be in a position to continue to develop a feature like that and make it stronger and in more games for people to use.
But we want better features, and if they do bring out something where they're like, hey, this loads your games instantly now, and not only that, but it actually improves frame times because it can move in the data quicker just even while you're moving around. Yeah. Even
that'd be a big win.
If it's mostly for AMD stuff, that would certainly be... That would push all of their competitors to try to do similar stuff at the same time as well, so that would be awesome.
Yep.
All right, well, I mean, that was the... didn't expect us to talk that much about Mantle. That was all of the stuff that we for the most part we're supposed to get to, unless you have anything else you want to talk about. But otherwise, plug your channel, tell everyone where they can find you.
Oh yeah, hopefully people have heard of Hardware Unboxed before, but if they haven't, obviously we're just on YouTube. Just type into your search bar, go Hardware Unboxed and see our videos and performance analysis and stuff. Obviously throughout the back half of this year, there's going to be some pretty major launches. So we'll be trying to cover those as in-depth as possible. And yeah, hopefully we'll be able to revisit some of the interesting things we've found over the past couple of years, things like, the driver overhead situation with Nvidia. Hopefully we'll be able to revisit that with next generation GPUs to see how the situation plays out there. How does it play out for things like ray tracing and things like next generation image upscaling or whatever's going on. We'll try and do those sorts of analysis for you. So check out Hardware Unboxed.
Yeah, I hope you're going to find time to take a vacation in the next couple of months, because after those 2 months, it's going to go Lovelace, Raptor Lake, RDNA 3, Meteor Lake, and then Zen 5, and of course Alchemist is in there, hypothetically. And then, of course, we'll get Battle Mage and probably Arrow Lake. So I think we have all of those in the next 20 months. So I hope you find time for a vacation at some point before or during that.
Oh, hopefully there'll be time for a break. But, I think over the past couple years, it's been well, since the last major launches we saw at the end of 2020, it has been fairly slow for hardware launches. So I prefer it to be a bit busy, a bit more exciting things to talk about on the channel. And I think that's going to start happening in the sort of second half of this year, and then obviously for the next 20 months, as you've been talking about, we should be getting some exciting things. But yeah, that's great. Just makes the job more exciting and more interesting to get on and make videos every week.
Well, find those videos at Hardware Unboxed on YouTube. And otherwise, remember, this is Moore's Law is Dead. Make sure YouTube didn't unsubscribe you. Subscribe to Broken Silicon on your podcast app on choice and give us a review. We have a Patreon as well. And thanks to everybody for listening.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Good to be on.
This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, I don't do this alone. Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother, Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, and special assistance by Carbon Cry. Find all of our information, including the information of sponsors you can support, at www.mooreslawsdead.com. If you would like to send fan mail or hardware to us, please mail parcels to Moore's Law is Dead at P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. And speaking of fans, patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content possible. The aging business model of spamming ads all over the content is dying. The future of media will be built on fans paying for the content they actually want to exist. And so if you have the extra money, but only if you do, please consider supporting us. For just $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to have your questions read aloud on Broken Silicon, Die Shrink, and Loose Ends, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord, full of like-minded people who would love to meet you and talk to you about computer hardware. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the entire back catalog of Flyover States podcasts and other projects Moore's Law is Dead has done, and thanks in the credits of videos and other perks as well. And hey, if you can't afford to support us, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family on social media, Reddit, and forums. And give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or your preferred podcast app. All of this really does help so much. And if you'd like to advertise on the podcast, hire Tom for consulting, or are a person of interest who would like to be a guest, please reach out to the email address mlhbdead@gmail.com. But as I said, this podcast would not be possible without its patrons supporting it, and so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher producer levels: Brad Medlin, Drita Full, AV, Anthony Gareffa, Greg Pataki, Mohammed Al-Kawari, Brett Jones, Aaron Close, BBC 6800 XT Big Sexy, Jan Rauner, Daniel Hyde, Ivan K, Brian Riggleman, Joaquim Hagan, Sam Miller, Deke, Thomas Rupp, The Mechanical Philosopher, Terrence Herod, SNES Chalmers, Tom Bailey, Greg T. Wanchik, Andrew S., Dane Galanowski, Daniel D., MJB1, Eric Jackson, Justice Brennan, Sammy Good, Valco Malev, The Boss, Haas, I Love You, Lynn and Jim, Spamton G. Spamton, Jonathan, Jeremy So, General Drips, Blake, Franco Frederic, Matthew Lazier, Jensen Wang, Nathan Mose, Azuris, Gregory S. Acker, Dominique Koch, Jake Dude 23, Jake Martin, My Name is Nobody, Caillou Markelli, Hardforum.com, Original Ross, Slickies, Stefan, David Cowden, Ricky Tans, Christopher A. Butler, Jeremy Scalen, Sarcastro, Stephen Hart, Jason B., Meat and Pork, Stu, Tim Robb, Luis Correa, Ian Clifford, Jesse Jeskowiak, Travis Gooding, Holden Mobley, Nanyan, Chris Witch, Deep Learners, Mads, Zootsu Taylor, Stephen Coates, Michael McGee, Benjamin Oshley, Semi Malascraig, Trini, Patrick Groh, Amiable Chief, Brett Summers, Denny Nugent, Arcane 311, Tommy, Kunden, Brucha, Mark Mitchell, John Wissink, Damon Peterson, James Anderson, Y Trui, Mark Raidmaker, Seth Dommings, 3DS Boy 08, Hal Buma, Narithiel, Matthew Landavaso, Stefan Koatic, Henry Shang, Judson N, F7GOS, The Grid, Michelle Pell, D31337 Antics, Jason Bowen, Noah, Nicoella, Hexapuma, Chrysantine, Jerem Barriera, Zabeat 03, D6, Thomas A. Teef, Klein, Brit Inian, DNA Tech, 50C Desert, Axel Ciceros, Royce Meyer, Charles Russell, Reginald R.E., Morphisis, Teak Autumn, Jackson Miller, JSMMH, Sandy Garrido Saunderson, David Eastland, Fire Falcon on YouTube, Andre Jacques, Gamin Since Reagan, Jeff Sedler, Eric Osborne, Loophole 35, Winstar Joker, James I. Raider, Corey Leonard, Sammy Molas, and of course, thank you to Sahara for the music.